Hey my friend, settle in, get comfortable. Tonight's story is going to show you something you have genuinely never seen before, a side-gilded world that almost nobody thinks to look for. Before tonight's story gets going, I want to say one quick thing. If this place has quietly become part of your bedtime routine, a like or a subscribe genuinely helps this small channel keep going. It costs you nothing, and it means more than you would think. And I would truly love to know where you are listening from tonight. Maybe you are tucked into a quiet flat in Melbourne. Maybe you're lying awake somewhere in Texas. Wherever you are, leave it in the comments. I read every single one, truly. I really do love this little community we have built here. All right, love. Let your shoulders drop. Let your hands rest. Let's go. Forget the ballroom. I know that is where your mind went, because it is where everyone's mind goes when you hear the words Gilded Age mansion. The chandeliers, the orchestra tuning up behind potted palms, the 12 courses arriving on porcelain rimmed in gold, the women in dresses that cost more than a labourer's yearly wage moving through rooms built specifically to be looked at. That is the version you've seen 100 times, in documentaries, in prestige television, in the plaques bolted to the front of buildings that are museums now. It is not wrong, exactly. It happened. But it is only the top 2 inches of a house that in some cases ran 6 stories deep, and I do not mean deep in the sense of tall, I mean deep in the sense of buried. Because underneath the marble stairs and the silk wallpaper and the family portraits hung 3 high in gilt frames, there was another house entirely, a narrower one, a hotter one with its own stairs, hidden inside the walls, so narrow that 2 people could not pass without one turning sideways, one with its own clock, its own language, its own rules, its own hunger. Tonight we're not going upstairs. Maybe you are the kind of person who has always wondered what happened behind the green baize door, the one that separated the family's world from the world that kept it running. Maybe you are someone who, watching one of those glossy historical dramas, found your eye drifting away from the woman in the beautiful dress and toward the girl standing silently in the corner holding a tray, wondering what her day looked like before this moment and what it would look like after. Maybe you are someone who has worked in service yourself, in some form, in some version of it that this century produced instead, and you know something about being present in a room and invisible in it at the same time. Whoever you are tonight, I think you will feel at home down here, because this house was built for people like you to run it, and never, not once, to be seen doing so. It is the year 1900. A Fifth Avenue mansion, the kind with a French name carved somewhere over the entrance that nobody in the family can quite pronounce correctly, though of course nobody would ever say so. Upstairs, in perhaps 2 hours, 30 guests will arrive for dinner, and the story of that dinner is the one that gets written down, in the society pages, in the letters guests send afterward, describing the terrapin soup and the orchid arrangements. But right now, at 5 in the afternoon, we are 3 floors below the dining room, in a kitchen lit by gas jets and the orange glow of a coal range the length of a modern automobile, and the air is thick enough to chew, heavy with the smell of scorched sugar and boiling stock and coal smoke that never quite finds its way entirely up the flue. A woman is standing at a scarred wooden table, and her forearms are dusted white with flour to the elbow, and she has not sat down since 4 this morning. Maybe she's 19 years old, and this is her first position, and her hands still shake sometimes when the housekeeper walks past, though she's getting better at hiding it. Maybe she's closer to 40, and she has worked in 6 houses across 2 countries, and there is nothing about this kitchen that could surprise her anymore. Not the heat, not the shouting, not the particular exhaustion that lives in the bottom of your spine after enough years of this. Whoever she is, here is the detail that I want you to sit with for a moment, because it is the whole shape of tonight's story folded into one small plain fact. In roughly 2 hours, this woman will send upstairs a dinner of almost unimaginable abundance. Terrapin soup, canvasback duck, ices moulded into the shapes of swans, and she will not taste a single bite of it. Not because she is too busy, though she is, because it was never, under any circumstance, made for her. That is the paradox this whole house was built around, and nobody upstairs ever had to think about it twice. Let me show you the house properly. Not the front of it, the one photographed for the newspapers, the one with its limestone facade and its bronze doors and its window boxes changed out 4 times a year by a florist who's paid more for a single arrangement than a scullery maid earns in a month. I mean the actual house, the working structure of it, the one an architect drew up with as much care as he gave the grand staircase. Because separating these two worlds was not an afterthought. It was the entire point. Here is something that surprises people every single time I mention it. In a mansion of this size, built for a family of perhaps 6, there might be living and working within its walls anywhere from 15 to 30 servants. 15 to 30 people, sleeping, eating, dressing, quarrelling, falling in love, growing sick, growing old, inside a building whose owners had gone to considerable architectural trouble to make sure they were never, under ordinary circumstances, required to look at any of it happening. The mechanism for this was the service stair. Every grand house of the period had at least 1, usually 2, sometimes 3, threaded through the building like a second nervous system, hidden behind unmarked doors, walled off from the family's room so completely that a guest dining upstairs might never register that 6 feet beyond the wallpaper, a boy of 13 was hauling a scuttle of coal up 4 flights because the nursery fire had gone low. The family staircase was wide and shallow, designed for the specific purpose of being descended slowly, in a good dress, while being watched. The service stair was steep, narrow, often spiral, lit by a single gas jet or none at all, and designed for exactly the opposite purpose. It existed so that a person carrying 2 full coal scuttles, 1 in each hand, could climb 4 flights in under 2 minutes without ever crossing the family's line of sight. I find myself genuinely struck every time I read house plans from this period by how much thought went into that invisibility. It was not incidental. Architects like the ones who built these Fifth Avenue and Newport mansions were explicitly instructed, and this shows up again and again in surviving correspondence between wealthy clients and their builders, to design the house so that a servant could move from any point to any other point without being seen from the principal rooms. Some houses had entire secondary hallways running parallel to the main ones, connected by doors disguised as wall panels, so a housemaid could slip from the linen closet to the 3rd-floor bedroom without ever setting foot in the corridor a guest might use. Dumbwaiters connected kitchen to dining room so that food could travel 3 floors without a human being visibly carrying it. Speaking tubes, brass-mouthed and running through the walls like a second, whispered version of the house. Let the housekeeper on the 2nd floor speak directly into the ear of the cook in the basement, without either of them leaving her post. And then there were the bells. If you have ever visited one of these houses as a museum, and some of them still stand turned into historical sites you can tour for the price of admission, you may have seen the bellboard, usually tucked into a passage near the kitchen or the servants' hall. Picture a wooden panel, waist height to shoulder height, mounted with a row of bells, each one labelled by hand or by small brass plate. Morning room, library, blue bedroom, Mr. Whitfield's dressing room, nursery. Every one of those bells connected by wire, sometimes running the entire length of the house, to a small pull or button in the corresponding room upstairs, so that a lady reclining on a chaise in her morning room could summon a housemaid from 3 floors away with a single motion of one gloved finger, without rising, without calling out, without acknowledging in any way that a specific human being was about to abandon whatever she was doing and climb a flight of stairs to find out what was wanted. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because I think it tells you something true and slightly uncomfortable about how this world was built. The entire architecture of communication in these houses ran in one direction. The family could summon. The servants could not summon back. A housemaid polishing silver in the pantry had no bell to ring if she needed something from the lady of the house. The wire only ran one way, literally, physically, wound through the walls of the building itself. If a servant needed to speak to a family member, There were rules, unwritten but absolute, about how that was permitted to happen. You did not initiate conversation. You did not make eye contact that lingered. If you were dusting a room and the mistress of the house entered, you turned your face slightly away, continued your work with your eyes down, and if at all possible, found a reason to leave within a minute or two, so that she could occupy the room as though it were empty of anyone but herself. There is a phrase from this period, used in more than one household manual, and repeated in the memoirs of former servants, that has stayed with me since I first came across it. A good servant, one guide advised, should move through the house like a shadow, present enough to be useful and absent enough to be forgotten. I want to be honest with you about something. I have read a lot of history for this channel, a great deal of it difficult in one way or another, and that particular sentence is one of the ones that has genuinely lodged itself somewhere behind my ribs. Present enough to be useful, absent enough to be forgotten. That was not a description of bad service. That was the entire job description, stated plainly, in a manual written to train young women for exactly this life. Now, let us talk about who actually lived inside that second, hidden nervous system of the house, because it was not one undifferentiated mass of people called the staff. It was its own society, every bit as ranked and codified and status-conscious as the one upstairs, and in some ways more rigidly so, because everyone below stairs knew exactly where they stood, to the inch, and knew that the whole structure would collapse into chaos if they forgot it. At the very top of this world sat the butler. In a house of this size, the butler was not a servant in the way we casually use that word today. He was closer to a general manager, and in the largest households he might earn a salary that would astonish people who assume all domestic work paid a pittance. He was almost always male, almost always at least in his 30s by the time he reached this position, and he had typically worked his way up through years, sometimes decades, of service in lesser roles, footman, under butler, valet, learning the specific choreography of the wealthy households the way an apprentice learns a trade. His domain was the dining room, the wine cellar, the front door, and the male staff beneath him. He answered directly to the master of the house and, in the more old-fashioned households, almost exclusively to him, rarely to the mistress. A good butler knew the provenance and proper serving temperature of every bottle in a cellar that might hold thousands of them. He knew which fork preceded which course, without needing to think about it, the way you know which way to turn a doorknob. He knew, and this mattered enormously, exactly how much license he had to correct a young footman in front of guests without embarrassing the household, and exactly how much deference he owed a guest who was, by any honest accounting, considerably less competent than he was. Beneath him stood the footmen, and I want to pause on footmen for a moment because their job is one of the strangest, in a modern sense, of the entire hierarchy. A footman was often chosen, quite literally, for his height and his calves. I'm not exaggerating this or reaching for a colourful detail to entertain you. Household staffing manuals from the period discuss footman height as a genuine hiring criterion, and in the grandest houses, footmen were sometimes hired in matched pairs, similar in height and colouring, because they were meant to flank a doorway or a carriage step like a matched set of ornaments. Their silk-stockinged legs, on display beneath a short livery coat, were considered an important visual element of a fashionable household's presentation, to the point that some footmen powdered their hair and were dressed in a livery that had not meaningfully changed in style since the previous century, a kind of living costume that signalled the family's wealth and taste to anyone who saw it. The footman's actual labour involved carrying, serving, opening doors, standing at attention for hours at a stretch during dinners, and generally providing the visual and functional infrastructure of hospitality. It was physically demanding in a very particular way, not backbreaking exactly, but exhausting in the specific manner of having to hold your body in a state of controlled readiness for half a day at a time, unable to slouch, unable to sit, unable to let your face show boredom or fatigue no matter how badly your feet ached inside shoes never quite broken in properly. The housekeeper ruled the female side of the house with an authority that in practice often exceeded the butler's. though the two were technically equals answering to different aspects of household life. She managed the housemaids, the still room maids, the linen, the household accounts for provisions and supplies, and she carried on her belt, quite literally, a ring of keys that opened every locked cupboard, closet, and storeroom in the house, a detail that gave rise to her old-fashioned title in some houses of the woman who holds the keys. A housekeeper of real competence, and most of them were, held in her memory an entire inventory of the house, which linens were where, which silver pattern belonged to which service, how many candles remained in the third-floor closet, and she was the one who trained new housemaids in the specific standards of this particular household. Standards that varied meaningfully from house to house and that a servant moving between positions had to relearn each time. Below the housekeeper came the housemaids themselves, who did the physical work of keeping the house clean, room by room, floor by floor, in a rotation so precise and so relentless that it never fully finished, only paused. And below them, in the strictest houses, came a hall boy or a boot boy, often a child of 11 or 12, hired for the smallest and dirtiest tasks, carrying coal, blacking boots, running errands, sleeping in whatever corner of the servants' quarters had room for him. Then there was the lady's maid, who occupied a strange and specific position in this hierarchy because she did not answer to the housekeeper at all. She answered only to the mistress of the house, whom she dressed, undressed, whose hair she arranged, whose secrets, quite literally, she carried, because there is very little a lady's maid does not eventually come to know about the woman she serves. A skilled lady's maid was often a woman of some refinement herself, capable of reading French fashion plates, skilled with a needle to the point of being able to alter an imported Paris gown to fit perfectly, knowledgeable about hair, complexion, and the particular vanities of the woman whose most private hours she witnessed daily. Her counterpart on the male side was the valet, who performed a nearly identical function for the master of the house, managing his wardrobe, his linens, his shaving water, accompanying him on travel, and knowing in the same intimate and unspoken way considerably more about his employer's habits and moods than almost anyone else in the building, upstairs or down. And then, down in the kitchen, in a heat and a hierarchy all its own, came the cook, the kitchen maid, and at the very bottom, the scullery maid. The cook, in a house of this size, held a position roughly equivalent in authority to the housekeeper, though her domain was strictly the kitchen and its adjacent rooms, the larder, the still room, the game room where pheasant and venison hung until properly aged. She was often, in wealthy American households of this period, a woman trained in the French style, or she employed a French chef beneath her, because French cuisine was the undisputed language of status at a Gilded Age table, and a hostess who could not produce it correctly risked genuine social embarrassment. The cook's authority in her own kitchen was close to absolute, and there are accounts from the period, in memoirs and in household correspondence, of cooks who terrified everyone beneath them, including, on occasion, the housekeeper herself, because a great cook was difficult to replace and everyone in the house, from the butler down to the newest scullery maid, knew it. Beneath her, the kitchen maid did the bulk of the actual cooking labor, chopping, stirring, tending sauces, following the cook's instructions with a precision that left no room for improvisation, because a dish served wrong to 30 guests reflected on the entire household, and the consequences of a mistake rolled downhill fast and landed hardest on whoever was easiest to blame. And at the very bottom of the entire structure, upstairs or down, sat the scullery maid, usually the youngest girl in the house, often no older than 14 or 15, whose job was the washing, pots, pans, dishes, the vast unglamorous machinery of feeding 30 people a 12-course meal, scrubbed by hand in water that had to be heated on the same coal range doing the actual cooking, in a small stone-floored room usually called the scullery, cold in winter despite the range's heat because it was often positioned at the farthest, draftiest point from the kitchen proper. A scullery maid's hands by the end of a single season were often cracked and reddened from the combination of hot water, harsh soap, and constant immersion, a condition so common it barely warranted comment in the households themselves, though former scullery maids, writing decades later about their years in service, mention it again and again, almost as a kind of shared scar tissue across the whole profession. I want to say something plainly here because I think it is easy to hear a list like this and file it away as trivia, a set of job titles from a vanished world. But every single person in that hierarchy was, on average, working somewhere between 16 and 18 hours a day, 6 days a week, with perhaps one half day off if the household was generous, and one Sunday afternoon for church. The hierarchy was not decorative. It was how 30 exhausted, underslept, underpaid people managed to coexist in close quarters, under enormous physical strain, without the entire operation collapsing into disorder. Rank was not vanity down there. It was survival architecture, every bit as deliberate as the hidden staircase in the walls above them. Let us go back to that kitchen now, and let us go back further than 5 in the afternoon. Let us go back to the actual beginning of this house's day, because that is where you start to understand the scale of what we are talking about. The house wakes at 4 in the morning, not the family. The family will not stir for hours yet, some of them not until 10 or 11, because rising early was in this world faintly déclassé, a marker of people who had somewhere to be. No, the house wakes at 4 because someone has to light the ranges before anyone upstairs requires so much as a cup of tea, and that someone is usually the lowest servant in the kitchen hierarchy, the scullery maid or a hall boy shaken from sleep in a garret room on the top floor, dressing in the dark by feel because a candle costs money and the household is not paying for one to be burned on dressing. This kitchen, at 4 in the morning in an unheated Fifth Avenue mansion in what might be a cold snap of early spring or the tail end of winter is, I want you to understand, genuinely cold. Coal ranges retain almost no heat overnight, and the vast stone-floored basement kitchens of these houses, built partly below street level for practical reasons involving deliveries and drainage, held the outside temperature more faithfully than they held any warmth generated the day before. So the first task every single morning was building the fire, raking out yesterday's ash, laying kindling, coaxing a coal range the size of a modern kitchen island back to life, feeding it shovel by shovel from a coal scuttle, a heavy metal container, often brass or Japan tin, that had to be hauled up from the coal cellar and refilled several times over the course of a day. This was dirty, physically demanding work, and it left a fine black dust on everything it touched, including the hands and forearms of whoever did it, a dust that took considerable scrubbing to remove and that never entirely left the cracks of a scullery maid's knuckles by the end of a long service. Once the range was drawing properly, hot water had to be readied, not for the kitchen's own use, but for the family, because a lady's maid upstairs would soon need warm water carried up for her mistress's washstand, and that water travelled the only way it could in a house without reliable plumbing to every room, in cans, up the service stairs, by hand. By 5, the housemaids were rising too, moving room to room on the principal floors while the family still slept, doing the work that had to be finished before anyone with a claim on the house's appearance was awake to witness it being done. Grates were cleaned of yesterday's ash and relaid with fresh coal, because a lady descending to breakfast should never, under any circumstance, see evidence that a fire had ever needed tending by human hands. It should simply, magically, already be burning cheerfully when she entered the room. Carpets were swept, sometimes with damp tea leaves scattered first to trap the dust, a small trick passed down maid to maid that kept the swept dust from simply rising back into the air. Brass fittings on doors and stair rails were polished. Curtains were drawn back in a specific order, room by room, following a schedule the housekeeper had drilled into every girl on her staff, because a household that ran correctly was, above everything else, a household whose rhythms were invisible. Here is the detail I find myself circling back to again and again when I read about this period. The entire goal of the morning's labour, hours of it, performed by exhausted people in a cold building before dawn, was for none of it to be detectable. A lady descending to breakfast at 9 was meant to experience the house as a kind of ambient miracle. Warm rooms, clean grates, fresh flowers already arranged without a single visible trace of the 24 people who had been awake for 5 hours manufacturing that impression. The labour's highest achievement was its own invisibility. Do the work well enough, and it looks like no work was done at all. I want to slow down here for a moment, because there is something in that worth sitting with. We are used to thinking about hard work in terms of its visible results, a finished building, a harvested field, something you can point to and say, look what was made. But this was labour whose entire measure of success was leaving no trace of itself. The better you were at your job, the less anyone would ever know you had done it. That is a strange kind of skill to master, and a strange kind of invisibility to live inside day after day, year after year. The kitchen, meanwhile, moved into its own rhythm. Breakfast for the family, when it came, might be a relatively modest affair by the standards of the era. Eggs, chops, kippers, toast kept warm under silver domes, coffee brought up in a silver pot polished the night before to a shine that would show a distorted, elongated reflection of anyone who looked into it too closely. But breakfast for 30 guests was not what the kitchen staff was truly working toward on any given day. They were working toward dinner, always dinner, the meal on which a household's reputation genuinely rose or fell. And preparation for an evening dinner party of any real scale began not hours before, but the day before, sometimes 2 days before, with stocks simmering on the back of the range for 18 or 20 hours to develop the depth of flavour a good soup required, with sauces built in stages, with ices and creams that needed time in the icebox to properly set. And here is where I want to introduce you to some of the physical objects of that kitchen, because I think they tell you something the job titles alone cannot. The coal range itself deserves a moment, because I think we underestimate, from this distance, what an enormous and demanding machine it actually was. Cast iron, often 8 or 10 feet long in a house of this size, with multiple fireboxes that had to be individually tended, dampers that had to be adjusted by feel and experience to control heat in an era before thermostats existed in any form. Ovens that a cook learnt to read not by a dial but by holding her bare hand inside for a few seconds and counting. Too hot, and a delicate sauce would split. Too cool, and a roast would never properly brown. This knowledge lived nowhere but in the cook's own body, built up over years, and it could not be handed to a new girl in a single afternoon's instruction. It had to be earned the hard way through burned batches and ruined sauces and the particular, specific shame of having to tell the housekeeper that something needed to be started over with guests arriving in 3 hours. Then there was the icebox, which is not, despite the name's similarity, anything like a modern refrigerator, and I think it is worth being precise about the difference, because the difference is the whole point. An icebox was the insulated wooden cabinet, lined with zinc or tin, into which large blocks of ice, delivered several times a week by an iceman whose cart made its rounds through the city, were loaded into a compartment at the top. Cold air, being heavier, sank down through the cabinet, keeping the food below it cool, while the melting water drained away through a pipe into a pan that had to be emptied without fail, or it would overflow onto the floor. Someone, usually the lowest kitchen servants, was responsible for checking that drip pan multiple times a day, an unglamorous, thankless, entirely necessary task that appears nowhere in the society page's description of a gracious Fifth Avenue home, but without which the household's cream would sour and its meat would spoil within a day in the summer heat. The copper pots hanging along the kitchen walls, sometimes in matched graduated sets from the largest stock pot down to the smallest sauteaus, were prized precisely because copper conducts heat so efficiently, giving a skilled cook the kind of fine control a lesser metal could not offer. But copper has a cost beyond its purchase price, because it must be kept scrupulously lined with tin, or it will react with acidic foods in ways that can genuinely poison whoever eats from it. And that tin lining wears thin with use and needs periodic retinning by a specialist tradesman. In the meantime, between retinnings, every single copper pot had to be scoured after use until it gleamed, a task usually falling to the kitchen maid or scullery maid, using a mixture of salt and vinegar or a specially formulated copper polish, scrubbed by hand until her own reflection, warped and golden, looked back at her from the curved surface. I want to mention the knife board too, because it is such a small, specific object, and it tells you something true about the texture of this labour. A knife board was exactly what it sounds like, a wooden board coated with an abrasive substance, sometimes emery powder mixed with a binding agent, sometimes simply a rough brick surface against which kitchen knives were drawn repeatedly to keep their edges honed. A dull knife in a working kitchen was not a minor inconvenience. It was dangerous, requiring more force and therefore more risk of slipping, and it was inefficient in a kitchen where every minute of the day was already accounted for twice over. Knife sharpening happened daily, sometimes twice daily during a heavy entertaining season, and it was one of those small maintenance tasks that never appeared in any account of the finished meal but that made the finished meal possible. Upstairs, a different set of objects governed a different kind of labour. The bootjack, a simple wooden or metal device shaped like a low V, into which a gentleman's boot heel was fitted so that a servant, usually a footman or a valet, could pull it free without having to kneel and wrestle it off by hand, though in practice a good deal of kneeling still happened, particularly with a tightly fitted evening boot. The candle snuffer, a small scissor-like tool with a cup on one blade, designed to extinguish a candle flame without scattering hot wax or sending up a plume of smoke that would leave a smell lingering in a fashionable drawing room, and the flat iron, heated not by electricity, which had not yet reached most households in any meaningful domestic form, but by the fire itself. Several irons kept rotating on a trivet near the hearth so that one was always hot while another cooled, used by a laundry maid to press linens, shirts, and the vast quantities of white cotton and linen that a wealthy household of this era consumed and laundered on a schedule so demanding that some of the largest houses maintained their own dedicated laundry rooms and staff entirely separate from the rest of the domestic operation. I mention all of this not to give you a museum inventory, though I will admit I do find a certain quiet pleasure in these objects, in imagining the specific weight of a coal scuttle in a scullery maid's hand, the particular ache that develops in a wrist after an afternoon spent scouring copper. I mention it because I think the objects themselves are a kind of testimony. Each one represents a task, and each task represents an hour, and the hours, stacked one on another, 16 or 18 of them most days, are the actual substance of what we are talking about tonight when we say the word service, not a costume drama word. A physical, exhausting, repetitive, skill-demanding reality that occupied nearly every waking hour of nearly every day of these people's working lives. Now I want to bring you back to the thing I mentioned at the very beginning, because it is time to look at it directly instead of glancing past it. The food. A Gilded Age dinner party of the kind we are describing, 30 guests, 12 courses, was a genuine spectacle of consumption, and the historical record of these menus survives in remarkable detail because society hostesses of the era were, in their own way, proud enough of their table to have menus printed, sometimes on cards edged in gold, sometimes copied faithfully into the diaries of guests who wanted to remember exactly what they had eaten at Mrs. So-and-so's the night the orchids came from her own greenhouse in Newport. A typical menu of this kind might open with oysters on ice, move through a clear soup and perhaps a thick one as well, offer a fish course, usually something delicate like pompano or a sole in a rich sauce, proceed to a saddle of mutton or a fillet of beef, pause for a sorbet designed specifically to clear the palate before the meal's second half began, continue into game. Canvasback duck was a particular status symbol of the period, its rich, slightly gamey flesh prized above almost any other bird. Move on to a salad, then cheese, then a dessert course that might include ices molded into elaborate shapes, spun sugar constructions, and a selection of fresh fruit arranged in pyramids on silver stands. Coffee and liqueurs closed the evening. The whole production, from first oyster to last sip of coffee, might last 3 hours, and it required a kitchen staff working, as we have said, for a full day or two in advance. Now, let us go downstairs to the servants' hall and look at what the people who made all of that actually ate. The staple of servant meals in this period was, overwhelmingly, plain and repetitive. Bread, a great deal of it, usually of a coarser grind than what appeared upstairs, because white flour, more heavily processed, was itself a marker of status, and even the flour a household bought carried an implicit hierarchy. Meat, when it appeared, was often the offcuts, the pieces too tough or too plain for the family's table, boiled rather than roasted, because boiling was cheaper in fuel and more forgiving of a cut that needed long, slow cooking to become tender. Cheese, sometimes. Tea, weak and heavily sweetened, because sugar was one of the few small luxuries a household would extend downward without much complaint, since it was, relatively speaking, inexpensive. Porridge in the mornings. Vegetables, but rarely the delicate, out-of-season, hothouse-grown vegetables that a wealthy household's own greenhouse might produce for its own table in January, the kind of thing that appeared in the society pages as evidence of a hostess's taste and resources. There is a particular kind of injustice here that I want to name plainly, because I think it is easy to let it slide past as simply how things were, an unremarkable feature of the period, rather than something that should stop you, even now, even at this distance. The people preparing a canvasback duck, a bird so prized that a good specimen might be individually selected and inspected before purchase, so rich that etiquette guides of the era specified precisely how it should be carved to preserve its juices, were themselves eating boiled mutton and bread 3 floors below, on the same night in the same house, close enough that the smell of the roasting duck likely reached the servants' hall through the same passages that carried heat and smoke throughout the building. This is not a metaphorical distance we are discussing. This is people separated by a single flight of stairs, cooking food they would never taste, in quantities that would have fed their own families for a week, for guests who would leave much of it on their plates, because a fashionable dinner party guest was not expected, and in fact was subtly discouraged from appearing to eat with any real appetite. I think about the leftovers sometimes, because the historical record on this point is genuinely interesting and slightly complicated. In many households, food that came back from the dining room, particularly items that had not been directly served onto a guest's plate, portions still in serving dishes, untouched rolls, cheese not yet cut into, did eventually make its way to the servants' hall or to the housekeeper's own table, where she and the upper servants, the butler, the lady's maid, the valet, sometimes ate somewhat better than the housemaids and kitchen staff below them, because rank, as we discussed earlier, governed everything, including exactly how much of the family's abundance trickled down and to whom. A housekeeper's table might occasionally include a genuine taste of something extraordinary, a spoonful of the terrapin soup, a sliver of the beef, if enough remained and if she judged it appropriate to share it. But this was inconsistent, dependent entirely on the particular household's customs and the particular housekeeper's temperament, and it was never something a scullery maid or a young kitchen maid could count on. For them, the rule held firm almost everywhere. You cook it, you do not eat it. That is simply how the house works. Let me be fair to the complexity here, because history rarely offers a clean villain, and I think oversimplifying it does a disservice to everyone involved, including the people we are trying to honor by remembering them accurately. Not every employer was cruel or thoughtless about this divide. Some households, and there are accounts of this in servants' memoirs from the period, did make deliberate efforts to feed their staff reasonably well, understanding on some level that a hungry, exhausted staff made mistakes, and mistakes at a dinner party for 30 guests were expensive and embarrassing in ways that mattered enormously to a hostess's reputation. A pragmatic self-interest sometimes produced better treatment than a purely moral one might have. That even in the better households, even where meals below stairs were adequate and reasonably regular, the fundamental asymmetry never disappeared. The family ate what they wanted, prepared by other people's hands, and the people whose hands prepared it ate what they were given, on a schedule set by someone else, in quantities determined by a household budget they had no voice in setting. There is a phrase that shows up in more than one servant memoir from this era, describing this specific feeling, the particular strangeness of spending a full day immersed in the smell of food you will never eat. one former kitchen maid, writing decades later about her years in a wealthy New York household, described coming to recognize the smell of a dish so completely from hours of preparing it that she could have described its taste in detail to someone who had actually eaten it, despite never once having put a spoonful in her own mouth. That detail has stayed with me since I first read something like it, knowing a food that intimately and never knowing it at all. And yet, and here is where the story turns, because I do not want to leave you with only the bleakness of it. There was one room in this entire vast, divided house where something genuinely different happened. The servants' hall itself. Every great house of this kind had one. A room below stairs, usually plain, whitewashed or papered in something far less fine than anything upstairs, furnished with a long table and simple chairs, sometimes warmed by its own small fire separate from the kitchen range. And it was here at meals, in the brief stretches of downtime that punctuated an otherwise relentless day, that something below stairs was permitted to exist that was forbidden almost everywhere else in the house. Ordinary conversation, laughter that did not have to be muffled, complaints spoken freely about a demanding guest or an unreasonable mistress or a butler in a foul temper. Gossip, some of it about each other, a great deal of it about the family upstairs whose private habits, quarrels, debts and disappointments were, whether they liked it or not, known below stairs with a completeness that would have mortified them had they ever fully understood it. This is worth pausing on, because I think it complicates the picture in an important way. The family upstairs believed, and needed to believe, that their servants were invisible, silent, essentially unaware of the texture of their private lives. The truth was almost the exact opposite. A staff of 15 or 20 people, moving through every room of a house, handling every letter, laundering every garment, overhearing every raised voice through walls that were not, whatever their expense, entirely soundproof, knew everything. They knew which guest bedrooms were used for something other than sleeping during a house party. They knew when the master's temper had worsened because of losses at the club. They knew, often before the family's own friends did, when a daughter's engagement was troubled or a son's debts had grown alarming. And in the servants' hall, over bread and weak tea, in the one space where the green baize door swung the other way and shut the family out rather than the servants in, they talked about it, freely. Sometimes cruelly, sometimes with real affection, sometimes both within the same conversation about the same person. I find something genuinely human in that, and I do not think it is a small thing. In a life defined almost entirely by watching what you say, where you look, how you carry your body through a room, the servants' hall was the one place a person could simply exist without performing invisibility. You could laugh loudly there. You could mimic just a little, just among people who would understand, the particular way the mistress said your name when she was displeased. You could complain about your aching feet without worrying it would be reported as insolence. Rank still applied, of course. The butler still sat at the head of that table, and a scullery maid still knew better than to speak out of turn in front of him. But compared to every other room in the house, it was a genuine sanctuary, and I think the people who lived and worked in these houses understood exactly how precious that was, precisely because it was the only such room they had. It was also, and this part matters just as much, where the real relationships of the house were built, because you cannot spend 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, for years at a stretch, in close quarters with the same 15 or 20 people, without something like a second family forming, messy and imperfect and occasionally resentful, but real. Friendships that lasted decades, servants who followed each other from position to position, writing letters when one moved on to a different household, are documented again and again in the surviving correspondence and memoirs of the period, and of course romances. Let me tell you something about romance below stairs in a house like this, because it is one of my favorite threads to pull on when I research this world. Precisely because it happened in the margins, in stolen minutes, against explicit rules that most households enforced with real seriousness. Many great houses forbade romantic relationships between staff members outright, or at minimum forbade marriage while both parties remained in service. On the theory, stated plainly in some household manuals, that married servants had divided loyalties and were more likely to leave the household entirely once they started a family of their own. A housekeeper's job included, whether she relished it or not, keeping a watchful eye for exactly this kind of attachment developing between, say, a footman and a housemaid, and separating them through reassignment if she judged the relationship to be interfering with either person's work or threatening to end in a resignation the household had not planned for. And yet it happened constantly, because of course it did. You put young people, sometimes in their late teens, more often in their 20s, in close daily contact, doing physical work side by side, sharing the one truly private hour of the evening after the family had gone to bed and before the house required attention again at dawn, and feelings develop. Footmen and housemaids exchanged glances across the servants' hall table that meant considerably more than the polite blankness on their faces during the day upstairs. A lady's maid and a valet, both occupying that strange semi-privileged position of intimate service to a single family member, might find they had more in common with each other than with almost anyone else in the building. Both of them carriers of secrets, both of them navigating a peculiar closeness to power that came with no actual power of their own. Here is the part I find most affecting, honestly. When these relationships were discovered or suspected by a housekeeper who might herself have once been young and in love in exactly this same position decades earlier, discretion often followed instead of immediate punishment. Fellow servants covered for each other constantly, arranging schedules so a couple might have a few unsupervised minutes, keeping watch for an approaching footstep, lying without hesitation to a housekeeper's direct question if the truthful answer would have ended someone's position in the house. This was not written down anywhere, obviously. You will not find it in a household account book, but it survives in the handful of memoirs former servants wrote later in life, looking back with a mixture of fondness and clear-eyed honesty at a world that demanded almost total submission from them during the day and, in its narrow off hours, occasionally let them be young. There were other kinds of secrets too, heavier ones, and this is where the loyalty of these households, real as it often was, took on its most complicated shape. A servant in this position saw things no outsider ever would. They saw a master's drinking when it crossed from social habit into something closer to a problem. They saw a mistress's private correspondence, not because they read it, though I imagine some occasionally did, but because they handled it, sorted it, sometimes noticed when a particular hand kept appearing on the envelopes and drew their own quiet conclusions. They witnessed arguments through doors not quite thick enough to fully contain raised voices. They saw debts, in the form of unpaid tradesmen's bills, that a housekeeper was instructed to manage with increasingly creative excuses, and they understood, long before most of society did, when a family's fortune was not what its Fifth Avenue address suggested. The rule, understood by everyone in the house without ever needing to be stated aloud in quite so many words, was silence. What happened in this house stayed in this house. And a servant who violated that unspoken code, who gossiped carelessly outside the servants' hall, who let a family's private business travel to another household's kitchen through the informal network that connected domestic staff across the city, the delivery boys, the shared tradesmen, the servants who occasionally met at church on their half-day off, that servant's career could end swiftly and permanently. A dismissal without a character reference, the letter a former employer wrote testifying to a servant's reliability and honesty, was close to a professional death sentence in this world. Without a good character, a servant could not secure another position in a respectable household, full stop. The entire system of domestic employment ran on these references, and everyone below stairs knew it, which meant everyone below stairs had an enormous, constant incentive toward discretion that had nothing to do with affection for the family and everything to do with simple survival. But I do not want to reduce this entirely to self-interest, because I think that misses something true as well. Across the surviving letters and memoirs of servants from this period, you find again and again something that reads as genuine loyalty, sometimes even genuine affection, extended toward employers who, by any honest accounting, barely registered these servants as individual people. a lady's maid who nursed her mistress through a difficult illness with real tenderness, a butler who managed a family's declining fortunes with a discretion that protected them from public embarrassment for years, at real cost to his own peace of mind. A cook who stayed with a family for 30 years, through good times and lean ones, because she had, in some genuine sense, come to think of the household as her own, even though the household's own account books never once listed her as anything other than an employee, a line item, a monthly wage. I think this complexity is important to sit with, rather than resolve too neatly in either direction. It would be simpler in some ways to tell you this was a purely exploitative system and nothing more, and in the ways that matter most, in wages, in power, in whose comfort took precedence over whose, it genuinely was that. But the people living inside it were not simply victims of an unjust arrangement, flat and one-dimensional. They built real lives within it, real friendships, real, if complicated, attachments to the families they served, and real pride in their own skill, in a perfectly executed dinner service, in a household run so smoothly that no outsider could detect the effort behind it. That pride was theirs, earned through their own competence, even when the credit for it, in the society pages, in the polite compliments guests paid their hostess on the way out the door, went entirely to someone else. Let us talk honestly about discipline, because it is part of this story too, and I do not think it serves anyone to soften it. A servant's day in a house like this ran according to a schedule set entirely by others, and infractions, even small ones, carried consequences that could be severe. A housemaid who broke a piece of the family's porcelain might have its cost deducted directly from her wages, a wage that, in the year 1900, might amount to something in the range of $10 to $20 a month for a junior position, room and board included, which sounds almost reasonable until you remember that room meant an unheated garret and board meant bread and boiled mutton, and that $10 represented a genuinely significant portion of her total income for an accident that took a single unlucky second to happen. A footman who arrived at his post smelling of drink, even faintly, even once, risked immediate dismissal, no matter how many years of otherwise faultless service preceded the lapse. A lady's maid who allowed her mistress to appear at a dinner party with her hair even slightly imperfect, a stray pin visible, a curl that had not held, might face a tongue lashing delivered with a coldness that servants who experienced it describe, decades later, as more painful than if they had simply been shouted at. And underneath all of this sat the constant, grinding, physical reality of the schedule itself. 16 hours was, if anything, an optimistic estimate for many positions during the height of the social season, when a household might host multiple dinner parties a week on top of its ordinary daily operations. Housemaids rose before 5 and were rarely finished with their duties before 10 at night, once the family's rooms had been readied for the following morning, fires banked, water carried up for the next day's washing, a single half-day off per week if the household granted it at all, and even then, a servant's half-day rarely began before early afternoon, once the midday meal had been served and cleared, which left only a handful of hours to see a friend, attend to personal errands, or simply rest a body that had not had a genuine, unhurried rest in longer than most of us could easily imagine. I want to be honest about something else too. Not every household was equally harsh, and not every mistress or master treated their staff with the coldness I have been describing. There are accounts, plenty of them, of employers who were genuinely kind, who inquired after a sick servant's health with real concern, who remembered birthdays, who gave thoughtful gifts at Christmas, who wrote references so warm they read almost like letters between friends. But even the kindest household operated within a system that assumed as an absolute baseline 16 and 18-hour days, minimal time off, wages that left almost nothing for savings after room and board were accounted for, and a total structural imbalance of power between employer and employed that no individual kindness could fully undo. A generous mistress made a hard system more bearable. She did not change what the system fundamentally was. Let us go back now to the kitchen we started in, because it is nearly 6 o'clock, and the house is beginning to change shape around us. Upstairs, the mistress has finished dressing, a process that began nearly 2 hours earlier and involved her own lady's maid, whose name, let us say, is Bridget, though of course upstairs she is addressed only as Ellis or Marie or whatever surname or invented French name the household prefers for its lady's maid, because even a servant's own name was sometimes considered too personal, too individual, for a family who preferred the comfortable fiction of interchangeable staff. Bridget has spent the last hour arranging her mistress's hair into a style copied from a fashion plate that arrived from Paris 3 weeks earlier, has helped her into a corset laced tight enough to shape the fashionable silhouette of the era, has fastened perhaps 40 small buttons down the back of an evening gown that took a Paris dressmaker's workroom the better part of 2 months to construct, has clasped a necklace whose insurance value alone likely exceeds Bridget's total lifetime earnings in service. Bridget will not attend the dinner. She will spend the evening in the dressing room, mending a hem, pressing a second gown for the following day, and waiting, because at midnight or later, whenever the last guest finally departs and the mistress climbs the stairs exhausted from an evening of performed delight, Bridget's actual workday, the intimate physical labor of unlacing, unpinning, and settling her mistress into bed, still lies ahead. Downstairs, the kitchen has entered what the staff themselves, in surviving accounts, sometimes called the push, the final concentrated hours before service began, when every single person in the kitchen hierarchy moved in a kind of choreographed urgency that left no room for a wasted motion. The cook stood at the center of it, tasting, adjusting, calling out instructions in a voice that carried over the clatter and hiss of a room this busy, this hot, this loud. The kitchen maid worked 3 tasks at once, sauce reducing on one burner, vegetables blanching in a pot beside it, plating instructions half remembered from the cook's earlier briefing running through her mind while her hands moved almost independently of conscious thought. The scullery maid, further behind than she wanted to be, scrubbed the enormous stock pot the terrapin soup had simmered in for most of the afternoon, her arms in water gone tepid and cloudy, knowing that clean pots would be needed again within the hour, and that falling behind now meant falling further behind all evening. And upstairs, at the front of the house, the butler stood in the entrance hall in the black and white formality of his evening dress, a costume as considered and specific in its own way as anything the mistress wore, and checked for perhaps the 3rd time the seating arrangement cards that would guide 30 guests to their correct places at a table where precedence, who sat nearest the host, who sat furthest, who sat beside whom, carried social weight that could genuinely wound or flatter depending on how carefully it had been calculated. A misplaced guest, seated below their expected rank, was not a small mistake. It was the kind of slight that could be discussed disapprovingly in drawing rooms across the city for weeks afterward, and the responsibility for avoiding it rested, in the end, on the butler's memory of 100 small social facts, who had quarrelled with whom, whose recent business failure made certain pairings awkward, which elderly guests hearing required a seat close to the head of the table. At 7:15, the first carriage arrived. From this point forward, for the next several hours, the house operated as 2 entirely separate performances running in parallel, occupying the same physical building but almost no shared reality. Upstairs, in rooms lit by hundreds of candles and the newer, still slightly novel electric lighting some of the grandest houses had recently installed, guests arrived in furs and evening dress, were announced by name at the door, moved through a drawing room thick with the specific mingled scent of hothouse flowers, French perfume, and the particular smell wealthy Victorian and Edwardian interiors seemed to develop from decades of coal smoke settled into upholstery and drapery, a smell so characteristic of these rooms that servants who worked in multiple such houses across their careers sometimes mention, decades later, that they can still summon it in memory more vividly than almost any other sensory detail from that period of their lives. Downstairs, Footmen moved through the same passage of time at a completely different tempo, carrying trays up the service stairs at something close to a controlled run, delivering each course to a staging area just outside the dining room where a final check occurred, garnish adjusted, sauce wiped from the rim of a plate, before the dish was carried in and served with a composed, unhurried grace that gave no real indication of the frantic 30 seconds that had preceded it in the passage outside. This gap between the visible calm of service and the invisible chaos that produced it is, I think, one of the truest things I can tell you about this entire world. Everything upstairs was designed to look effortless. Nothing about it was effortless. The effort simply lived somewhere the guests were never permitted to see. Let me walk you through the courses themselves, slowly, the way they would have actually unfolded that evening, because I think there is something almost hypnotic in the sheer choreography of a meal like this. And this is exactly the kind of detail I want you to let wash over you rather than track too closely. The oysters came first, opened that same afternoon by a kitchen hand whose entire task for perhaps 2 hours was nothing but the specific repetitive motion of working a short, blunt knife into the hinge of a shell, twisting, severing the muscle, arranging the open shells on beds of shaved ice that had been chipped by hand from a large block delivered that morning. 30 guests meant several hundred oysters, and the person shucking them that afternoon likely lost track, somewhere past the first 100, of the specific ache that had settled into her wrist, because there was no room in the schedule to stop and notice it. Then the soup, the terrapin, a dish so specifically associated with wealth in this period that its preparation alone required a particular specialized skill, because working with terrapin meat, extracting it properly, balancing the rich, slightly gelatinous broth against a generous addition of sherry, was not something every cook, even a skilled one, necessarily knew how to do well. It arrived at the table in a silver tureen carried by the butler himself, because certain dishes at certain points in the meal called for his personal handling rather than a footman's, a small distinction of protocol that meant something to everyone in that room, upstairs and down, even if no guest at the table could have told you exactly why the tureen in the butler's hands rather than a footman's signalled something particular about the course's importance. The fish course followed, pompano perhaps, or a delicate sole, sauced and presented with the kind of visual care that took a kitchen maid the better part of an hour to execute correctly across 30 individual plates, because presentation at this level of household was not an afterthought. It was understood explicitly in the cookbooks and household manuals of the period as being nearly as important as flavour itself, since a guest's first impression of a dish was visual and a beautifully composed plate signalled the same competence and taste that the flower arrangements and the seating chart and the orchestra tuning in the next room were all, together, working to project. Between courses, the pace in the passage outside the dining room never slowed. Empty plates came down, 30 at a time, carried on trays by footmen moving as quickly as dignity allowed, straight into the hands of a scullery maid whose entire evening consisted of an unbroken cycle of scraping, stacking and washing, so that clean plates would be ready again for the next course and the one after that and the one after that, 12 times over the course of the evening. I think about her specifically, whoever she was that particular night, standing at a stone sink in a room 3 floors below the laughter and candlelight, her hands raw, her feet aching, the sounds of the party reaching her only as a distant, muffled hum through the walls and floors between them, close enough to smell the food she would never taste, far enough that she might as well have been in an entirely different building. The mutton course came, and then the sorbet, served in small glass cups to clear the palate, a pause in the meal's rhythm that gave the guests a few minutes of lighter conversation before the meal's second half began in earnest. The canvasback duck arrived next, carved with real ceremony, its rich, dark meat considered by connoisseurs of the era to be at its absolute best, served rare, nearly bloody, a preparation some guests found thrilling and others, more delicately constituted, found difficult to finish, though etiquette of the period discouraged any visible sign of distaste at a hostess's table, no matter what was actually served. By the time the ices arrived, moulded that afternoon into the shapes of swans by a kitchen maid working with a set of pewter moulds that had to be packed in salted ice for hours to set properly. The dinner had been in progress for nearly 2 hours, and the energy in the room had shifted into the loose, warm, slightly loud register of a party that has been fed and wined generously enough to relax its earlier formality. Fresh fruit followed, arranged in careful pyramids that a housemaid pressed into kitchen service for the evening because every available pair of hands was needed, had spent nearly 40 minutes constructing that afternoon, one piece at a time, each layer supporting the weight of the one above it, a small architectural feat that would be dismantled by careless dinner guests within about 10 minutes of its arrival at the table. Coffee closed the meal, and by the time the ladies withdrew to the drawing room, leaving the gentlemen to their cigars and their own conversation over port, it was past 10 o'clock, and the kitchen staff, 3 courses behind on clean-up, and still needing to prepare a light supper that would be served to guests before midnight, as was customary at the grandest evening entertainments, had been working, without meaningful pause, for 18 hours. Let me pause the evening here for a moment, because I want to tell you something about who these people actually were, where they came from, before we go back to the last hours of that particular night. The domestic service workforce of Gilded Age New York was in overwhelming proportion made up of immigrants, and the specific mix shifted over the decades but held some consistent patterns. Irish women dominated the ranks of housemaids and cooks for much of the latter half of the 19th century, arriving in enormous numbers following the famine years and finding in domestic service one of the few reliable paths to employment available to a young woman with no capital, no connections, and often limited English when she first stepped off the boat. German and Scandinavian immigrants filled other roles. By the turn of the century, the picture was shifting again, with growing numbers of black women, many of them having migrated from the south, taking positions in northern households, often in roles that carried less prestige and lower wages than the positions still typically reserved by the informal but rigid preferences of the era's wealthy households for European immigrant or American-born white servants, particularly in the most visible upstairs roles like lady's maid or butler, where a household status was thought to be partly reflected in the staff a guest actually saw. I want to be honest about this layered hierarchy because it is important, and because I do not want to flatten this history into a simpler story than it actually was. The servants' hall itself, that space I described earlier as a kind of sanctuary, was not free of the era's broader prejudices. Ethnic and racial hierarchies that shaped the wider society did not simply dissolve at the kitchen door. An Irish cook might hold real authority over a kitchen staff while still facing the casual anti-Irish prejudice common in this period's popular press and private conversation. A black servant, regardless of skill or seniority, often found certain positions and certain households simply closed to her no matter how exemplary her record, because of assumptions her employers held and rarely examined. And yet within all of that, something like solidarity did form, forged less by shared identity than by shared circumstance. The same 16-hour days, the same aching feet, the same distant muffled sound of a party none of them would ever be guests at. I think that is worth remembering too. The kindness these people extended to each other, imperfect and unevenly distributed as it sometimes was, existed inside a system that gave them every reason to compete for favor and scarce advancement instead, and that friendship and loyalty grew there anyway says something genuine about the people involved, not about the system that housed them. Many servants began this work astonishingly young, a hall boy or a between maid, a position that literally meant working between the kitchen and the housemaid's duties wherever an extra pair of hands was needed that hour, might be no older than 11 or 12, sent into service because a family at home simply could not feed another mouth, and a live-in position, however hard, meant one less child to clothe and feed at home, and eventually small wages sent back to a mother or a younger sibling. Childhood, in the sense we would recognize it now, essentially ended for these children the day they walked through a service entrance for the first time, and it is difficult from this distance to read the household manual's matter-of-fact instructions for training a 12-year-old hallboy in his duties without feeling the weight of what that actually meant day to day for a child that age. At the other end of a service career, longevity was its own particular story. Servants who stayed with a single family for 20, 30, sometimes 40 years were not unusual, and these long-tenured staff members occupied an unusual position by the end of their careers, trusted in a way newer servants were not, sometimes genuinely fond of children they had watched grow from infancy into adulthood, sometimes the only witness left, decades later, to a family's earlier, less polished years before wealth had fully arrived and reshaped how they wanted to be seen. Their accounts of elderly former nursemaids kept on in a household long past the point of real usefulness, given light duties or none at all, simply because a family could not bring itself to dismiss someone who had rocked its children to sleep, who had nursed a fever through the night decades earlier, who had become in some unspoken and never quite acknowledged way part of the family's actual history even while remaining, on paper and in every formal sense, an employee. I do not want to overstate this. For every account of a beloved old retainer kept comfortably in her old age, there are others of servants dismissed the moment illness or age made them less useful, turned out with little more than a reference and whatever savings they had managed to set aside from wages that left almost nothing to save. Both things were true of this world, sometimes within the very same household, depending on which servant you asked and which employer's particular character you were describing. History rarely offers a single answer to a question like this, and I think that is worth sitting with rather than resolving too neatly. Let us go back to that particular night now, because the evening is not yet finished, and there is something in its final hours I want you to sit with. By 11, the last of the ladies had rejoined the gentlemen in the drawing room for coffee and conversation that would likely stretch past midnight, and the kitchen, several floors below, had entered its own final stretch, preparing the light supper that would be laid out around 11:30, cold meats, sandwiches, perhaps a final round of ices, for guests who would nibble at it more out of social ritual than genuine hunger after the enormous meal they had already consumed. The kitchen staff themselves, by this hour, were operating on the particular thin, wired kind of exhaustion that comes after 18 or 19 hours without real rest. The kind where your hands keep working from pure habit even as your mind starts to blur at the edges. At last, sometime after midnight, the first carriages began to depart, and the front hall filled briefly with the sounds of furs being retrieved, farewells exchanged, a final wave of compliments passed back to the hostess about the evening, the food, the flowers, compliments that would, within the week, likely appear in slightly altered form in the letters these guests wrote to friends who had not been present, cementing the household's reputation a little further with each retelling. The hostess stood at the door through all of it, composed, gracious, showing no visible trace of an evening that had, for her too in its own different way, been a performance requiring real stamina to sustain. The moment the last carriage pulled away, something in the house shifted almost audibly, a kind of collective exhale that ran from the front hall down through every hidden passage to the kitchen itself. The mistress climbed the stairs and Bridget was waiting, and the real work of unlacing began. The corset loosened stay by stay, the elaborate hairstyle taken down pin by pin and brushed out, the jewellery unclasped and returned to its cases, each piece checked against a small inventory the housekeeper kept, because valuable jewellery going briefly missing during an evening's chaos of guests and staff was not unheard of, and a careful lady's maid protected herself as much as her mistress by accounting for every piece before it went back into its velvet-lined box. Downstairs, the kitchen staff finally sat down, some of them for the first time since a brief pause at 4 that afternoon, and ate whatever remained of their own delayed evening meal, bread, cold meat, tea gone lukewarm hours ago, in a servants' hall lit by a single low-gas jet because the household did not pay for bright lighting this late, this deep into the building, where no guest would ever see it. I think this is one of the truest, quietest images this whole story has to offer. 30 guests had just left a table groaning with abundance. Canvasback duck and terrapin soup and ices shaped like swans. And 3 floors below, the people who had made every bite of it possible sat eating bread and cold meat by the light of a single dim flame, too tired, most nights, for much conversation at all. And yet, even here, even in this exhaustion, there was sometimes something worth having. A quiet joke about a guest's particularly demanding behavior that evening. A moment of real camaraderie between people who had, together, pulled off something genuinely difficult and had in their own way every right to a private, unacknowledged pride in it. The dinner had gone well, no course had arrived late, no dish had been sent back. Whatever tomorrow held, tonight's work was done, and done well, and for a few minutes, in the low gaslight, that was allowed to be enough. Let me tell you about the servants' own bedrooms, because I think this detail, more than almost any other, captures the actual physical shape of the divide we have been discussing all evening. In a Fifth Avenue mansion of this scale, the family's bedrooms occupied the second and third floors, generously proportioned rooms with high ceilings, marble fireplaces, large windows dressed in heavy drapery connected to dressing rooms and, in the more modern houses, private bathrooms with actual running water and porcelain fixtures imported from England. The servants slept above all of this, on the top floor, in what were typically called garret rooms. Small, low-ceilinged spaces tucked directly beneath the roofline, hot in summer because heat rises and there was little insulation between the servant and the sun-baked slate above her, and genuinely cold in winter because these rooms sat at the farthest possible distance from any heated flue in the building and were rarely allocated a fire of their own. A single servant's room, if she was fortunate enough to have one to herself rather than sharing with another maid, might contain an iron bedstead, a small washstand, a chest for her few personal belongings, and little else. The ceiling sloped sharply with the roofline, low enough in places that a taller servant could not stand fully upright near the walls. There was, in most houses, no rug on the floor, no wallpaper beyond a plain distemper, nothing of the visual richness that characterized every room 3 floors below. And yet for many young women arriving from crowded tenements or small rural cottages shared with 6 or 7 siblings, even this narrow, sloped, unindulated room represented something genuinely new, a space, however small, that was for a few private hours each night, entirely her own. I think there is something worth noticing in that particular contrast. The way the very same arrangement could represent both genuine deprivation relative to the luxury surrounding it just a few floors down, and a real, meaningful improvement relative to what many of these young women had left behind. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and I do not think either one cancels the other out. The housekeeper, and sometimes the cook, occupied somewhat better rooms, closer to the ground floor, reflecting their higher rank. A small but real material privilege that came with years of seniority and authority over the staff beneath them. And in some of the very grandest houses, a separate servants' wing existed almost as its own small building, connected to the main house but architecturally distinct, with its own stairs, its own modest common areas, a structure that let the family's architects achieve total separation, so complete that a guest touring the principal rooms of the house might never even glimpse the door that led to where 15 or 20 people actually lived. Livery deserves its own moment, because clothing in this house, upstairs and down, was never simply clothing. It was information worn on the body, broadcasting rank and role to anyone who knew how to read it, and everyone in this world knew exactly how to read it. A footman's livery, as I mentioned earlier, was often startlingly old-fashioned even by the standards of 1890 or 1900, deliberately so because a household's choice of livery style signaled something about its self-image, whether it wanted to project the newer, more understated elegance fashionable among some of the era's wealthiest families, or the older, more theatrical grandeur associated with European aristocratic households, which some newly wealthy American families found genuinely appealing to imitate, having no inherited aristocratic tradition of their own to draw on, and choosing, instead, to borrow one wholesale. The footman in a house pursuing this older style might find himself in a coat of a specific, sometimes garish colour unique to that family, the household's own livery colours, passed down and maintained as consistently as a coat of arms, paired with a waistcoat, breeches and stockings that had gone out of ordinary fashion for men generally a full century earlier. Powder for the hair in the households that still required it was a genuine daily chore, and more than one former footman's memoir mentions, with a certain wry humour decades later, the specific unpleasantness of having powder brushed through his hair every single morning for a job he had taken because his family needed the wages, not because he had any particular attachment to looking, in his own private assessment, faintly ridiculous. The housekeeper and the female upper servants, the lady's maid in particular, dressed in a manner that occupied an interesting middle ground, respectable, sombre, well-made but never fashionable in the way the family's own clothing was fashionable, because a lady's maid appearing too stylish risked being seen as presumptuous, reaching above her station in a way that made both her mistress and the household's other servants uncomfortable. Black was common, sometimes relieved by a small amount of white at the collar and cuffs, an aesthetic that, looking back at photographs from this period, can appear almost severe, and that in practice communicated, at a glance, precisely where this woman stood in the household's hierarchy without a single word needing to be exchanged. Housemaids typically wore a uniform that changed over the course of the day, a plain cotton print dress and apron for the early morning's dirtier work, cleaning grates, sweeping, hauling water, changed by afternoon into a fresh black dress with a white apron and cap, the more presentable version of herself required for the hours when she might actually be glimpsed by the family or their guests moving through the house. This changing of uniform twice daily was itself an additional task folded into an already impossibly full day. One more small, invisible piece of labour required simply to maintain the household's visual standard of what a proper servant should look like at any given hour. I find something genuinely poignant in thinking about these clothes, honestly, hanging in a narrow garret wardrobe or folded into a small chest, each one a kind of costume for a role this young woman performed competently for years in a house that would remember her, if it remembered her at all, primarily by the uniform rather than the person wearing it. Monday, in most of these households, meant laundry, and I want to walk you through it slowly because I think it is one of those pieces of domestic history that modern life has made almost impossible to intuitively understand, since we simply press a button now and think nothing further of it. A household of this size, with its family of 6 and its staff of 20 or more, generated an almost unbelievable volume of washing each week. Bed linens, changed regularly in the finest houses, table linens, used fresh at every meal and every course, since a tablecloth or napkin touched even lightly during dinner was considered unfit for reuse without laundering. Shirts, collars and cuffs for every man in the household, family and staff alike, at a time when men's fashion demanded a fresh white collar, stiffly starched essentially every single day. Undergarments for everyone in the house. Aprons and caps for the female staff, changed as we discussed at least once daily. The sheer tonnage of fabric moving through this household's laundry each week would astonish anyone encountering it for the first time. The process itself, in a house of this era, before the widespread adoption of any kind of mechanical washing assistance beyond a hand-cranked wringer, was punishing physical labour. Water had to be heated, enormous quantities of it, on the same coal-fired systems already straining to keep the kitchen and the household's hot water running. Washing was done by hand, in large tubs, using a washboard's ridged surface to work soap through soiled fabric, a task that left a laundry maid's hands raw and reddened within a single winter season, the skin cracking at the knuckles in a way that stung sharply every time it touched hot water or harsh soap again the next morning. Whites required boiling in a separate copper vessel dedicated to the purpose, to achieve the blinding, unblemished appearance that Gilded Age households considered an absolute baseline standard, never a luxury, simply the minimum acceptable result. Once washed, laundry had to be wrung by hand or through a mechanical wringer that itself required considerable arm strength to operate, then hung to dry either outdoors on lines in a service yard hidden from the street's view or, in bad weather, on racks near the kitchen range, competing for space and heat with the cooking itself. And once dry, the ironing began, using those flat irons I mentioned earlier, heated on rotation near the fire, each one weighing several pounds, requiring a laundry maid to press with real physical force to achieve a crisp, smooth finish on heavy cotton and linen, working through a mountain of shirts, collars, sheets, and table linens that seemed, by every account, to never actually diminish, because by the time one week's laundry was finished, the next week's had already begun accumulating. Starching added its own separate labour, particularly for the stiff collars fashionable men's shirts required, a process involving a specially prepared starch paste, applied, dried partially, then ironed with a particular technique that produced the glassy, rigid finish considered correct for formal wear. The laundry maid skilled at collar starching was genuinely valued because a poorly starched collar, limp or unevenly stiff, was the kind of small sartorial failure that a gentleman would notice immediately and that reflected, unfairly but inevitably, on the entire household's competence. I mention all of this in such detail because I want you to understand that Monday's laundry was not a single task completed and forgotten. It was a multi-day operation, often beginning Monday morning and not fully concluding until Wednesday, running in parallel with every other ordinary demand of the household, and it fell, in most houses, on a laundry maid or two whose entire job, week after week, year after year, was this single enormous, physically brutal cycle, repeated without end for as long as she held the position. The silver deserves its own mention too, because in a house like this, silver was not simply tableware. It was a genuine, considerable financial asset, sometimes worth more than the annual wages of the entire staff combined, and its care was treated with a corresponding seriousness. This pantry, a room most guests never saw and likely never thought about, was where this happened. A space fitted with deep sinks, felt-lined drawers for storing flatware without scratching, and locked cupboards for the household's most valuable pieces, because theft, while relatively rare in well-run households with careful hiring practices, was a genuine enough concern that a butler personally accounted for every piece of silver, checking it against an inventory after every large event, before locking it away each night. Polishing silver was a task usually assigned to a footman or, in some houses, a dedicated pantry boy, using a specially formulated polish, often containing a fine abrasive powder mixed into a paste, applied with a soft cloth in small circular motions, worked into every crevice of an ornately patterned piece, then buffed to the mirror shine that a good table setting demanded. A large dinner service, used for an event of 30 guests, might require the better part of a full day to properly clean and repolish afterward, tarnish from handling and exposure to food acids needing to be addressed before the pieces went back into storage, ready for the next occasion. I find something almost meditative in imagining this task, actually, hours spent in small repetitive circular motions, working a soft cloth against an engraved surface until your own distorted reflection stared back at you clearly. It was the kind of labour that left plenty of room for a servant's mind to wander even while her hands stayed occupied, and I suspect a great deal of quiet thinking, quiet worrying, quiet daydreaming about a life different from this one happened during these long, solitary hours in the pantry, hours that appear nowhere in any historical record because thoughts, unlike hours worked or wages paid, leave no ledger behind. Hiring itself operated through a system built almost entirely on the character reference, the letter I mentioned earlier that a former employer wrote testifying to a servant's honesty, competence, and reliability. Without one, a servant seeking a new position in a respectable household faced enormous difficulty, and the entire domestic service economy of a city like New York functioned on this network of references, sometimes supplemented by registry offices, a kind of early employment agency specifically for domestic staff, where prospective employers could review candidates and prospective servants could learn of open positions. This system gave enormous, largely unchecked power to employers, because a reference, once written, could not easily be contested or corrected. A servant dismissed unfairly, perhaps for a misunderstanding, perhaps because a jealous housekeeper wanted her gone, perhaps for reasons that had nothing to do with her actual competence, had essentially no recourse if that unfair dismissal resulted in a lukewarm or damaging reference. Her entire professional future rested on the goodwill, or at minimum the basic fairness, of people who held every structural advantage over her and very little formal accountability for how they exercised it. And yet again, the system was not uniformly harsh. Many employers, understanding the weight a reference carried, wrote them with real care and honesty, and a servant who had genuinely served well for years generally could expect a fair accounting of that service when the time came to move on. Whether by her own choice or the family's changing circumstances, the system was unjust in its structure, plainly built on an imbalance of power that could be and sometimes was abused. But within that unjust structure, individual people on both sides of the green baize door still tried in whatever ways were available to them to treat each other decently. I want to tell you about the seasons now, because a household like this one did not stay still through the year, and the movement itself created its own particular strain on the people whose job it was to make that movement seamless. Wealthy New York families of this era followed a social calendar as fixed and predictable as any liturgical one, the city season running roughly from November through the early spring, filled with the dinners, balls, and opera evenings that constituted fashionable winter life, followed by a migration, as regular as the tides, to summer residences, Newport chief among them for the very grandest families, where an entirely different set of enormous houses, styled by their owners with a certain determined modesty as cottages despite containing 70 rooms or more, hosted an equally demanding, if somewhat more relaxed in tone, summer social season. This migration meant, for the household staff, an entire second household to open, air out, and staff, sometimes with additional servants hired locally for the season, sometimes with a reduced core staff travelling from the city home and taking on considerably more individual responsibility once there. Trunks had to be packed with a precision that accounted for weeks of anticipated social engagements, each requiring its own specific wardrobe, and a lady's maid's skill at packing efficiently. Protecting delicate fabrics from creasing during the journey was as genuinely valued as her skill at hairdressing, because a gown that arrived at Newport crushed and unwearable was a real, practical problem with no easy solution once you were already there. The Newport houses themselves, for all their differences in architecture and setting, replicated the exact same below-stairs structure as their city counterparts, the same hidden service stairs, the same rigid hierarchy, the same divide between family table and servants' rations, transplanted wholesale to a new location, as though the entire social ecosystem simply packed itself up each spring and reassembled itself by the sea. Some servants found the change of scenery a genuine, if modest, pleasure, salt air instead of coal smoke, a slightly different rhythm to the days even if the fundamental demands remained the same. Others found the seasonal upheaval simply one more exhausting demand layered onto an already exhausting profession, 2 full households to master instead of 1, twice the packing, twice the unfamiliar kitchen equipment to learn, twice the local tradesmen and delivery schedules to establish from scratch. Illness, when it came, was its own particular crisis in this world, because a servant who fell seriously ill faced consequences that a family member simply did not. The household's own physician, engaged at real expense when a family member fell ill, was not automatically extended to the staff, and many servants, when genuinely sick, either continued working through illness that would today warrant immediate rest, out of fear that time off meant lost wages or worse, or relied on whatever basic care a sympathetic housekeeper chose to arrange, sometimes genuinely attentive, sometimes minimal. Tuberculosis, common across all classes in this period but disproportionately devastating in crowded, poorly ventilated living conditions, took a real toll among domestic staff, whose garret bedrooms, however small a private comfort they represented, were rarely well ventilated and rarely warm enough in winter to support genuine recovery from serious respiratory illness. I do not tell you this to end our evening on a note of grimness, exactly, but because I think leaving it out would be its own kind of dishonesty. This was a demanding, sometimes genuinely dangerous life, physically and in terms of the precariousness with which illness or injury could unravel a servant's entire livelihood. And I think honouring the people who lived it means being willing to look at that clearly, rather than only at the parts of the story that are easier to romanticize. Let me tell you a story now, a composite one, built from the kind of small incident that appears in slightly different forms again and again across servants' memoirs from this period, because I think a single specific moment can sometimes explain this world more clearly than any general description. Imagine a housemaid. Let us say her name is Margaret, 22 years old, 3 years into her position in a house very much like the one we have been walking through tonight. One winter afternoon, hurrying between rooms with an armful of freshly ironed linen, she rounds a corner too quickly and collides with a small side table and a porcelain vase, a genuinely valuable one, imported. Part of a matched pair the mistress is particularly attached to, topples and shatters against the floor. Margaret's first reaction, before anything else, before even the shock of the sound fully registers, is fear, immediate and total, because she knows exactly what a broken piece like this can mean. Deduction from her wages, most likely, wages that already leave her almost nothing to send home to her mother after room and board. Possibly worse, a housekeeper in a foul mood, or a mistress who has had a difficult week already, might treat this as grounds for dismissal, and dismissal, as we discussed, without a strong character reference to soften it, could mean real difficulty finding another position at all. Here is where the story I want to tell you actually begins, because Margaret is not alone in that hallway for more than a few seconds before another servant appears, drawn by the sound. Let us say it is the head housemaid, older, more senior, who arrives first, takes in the shattered pieces on the floor, and makes a decision in the space of perhaps 3 seconds that tells you everything about how this world actually worked beneath its official rules. She does not report exactly what happened. When the housekeeper arrives, summoned by the noise, the story that gets told is different, softened, reshaped just enough. Perhaps the vase was already loose on its stand, a known hazard several of the staff had noticed and meant to mention. Perhaps it was simply an accident that could have happened to anyone, phrased in a way that spreads the responsibility thin enough that no single person bears the full weight of it. The housekeeper, who has managed this household staff for 11 years and has seen this exact small drama play out in a dozen variations, may well suspect the truth is somewhat more specific than the story she is being told. But she also understands, in her own long experience, the difference between an accident and genuine negligence, and she chooses in this moment not to press for the precise damning detail that would turn a costly mistake into a dismissible offence. This is not written down anywhere. There is no household ledger entry that reads, "On this date, staff conspired to protect a junior housemaid from consequences she would otherwise have faced." But this exact pattern, small, quiet, unofficial acts of protection extended servant to servant, sometimes even servant to junior servant by a housekeeper who technically held the authority to punish more severely and chose instead restraint, appears again and again in the oral history and memoir record of this period, enough times that I think we can trust it represents something real and common, not simply a comforting story a few former servants told themselves later in life. I find something worth genuinely admiring in this, honestly. In a system with almost no formal protections for the people working inside it, no labour union, no legal recourse worth mentioning, no real check on an employer's power to dismiss at will, the servants themselves built their own quiet, informal system of mutual protection, imperfect, inconsistent, dependent entirely on individual character and relationship rather than any codified right, but real enough that it mattered, real enough that a Margaret in a hallway with a shattered vase at her feet and her whole livelihood suddenly feeling uncertain, could sometimes, not always, but sometimes count on the people around her to soften what was coming. Let me tell you about the nursery, because it occupied a genuinely strange middle position in this entire architecture of separation, closer in some ways to the family than any other part of the servants' world, and yet still, fundamentally, a service role governed by the same rules of invisibility as everything else below stairs. A nurse, in a wealthy household of this era, held responsibility for the children's daily care almost entirely, feeding, bathing, dressing, disciplining, comforting through nightmares and illness, teaching manners and early lessons in a hands-on, constant way that meant she often spent more waking hours with these children than either parent did. This was simply the accepted structure of upper-class children in this period. A mother's relationship with her own children, particularly in infancy and early childhood, was often formal and scheduled. An hour in the late afternoon when the children, freshly washed and dressed by the nurse, were brought down to the drawing room to be presented briefly, charmingly, before being returned upstairs for their own separate dinner and bedtime, managed entirely by staff. I think this detail surprises people more than almost any other in this whole story. The sheer degree to which wealthy Gilded Age parents were, by design, somewhat distant figures in their own children's daily lives, present at scheduled moments, genuinely loving in their own way, but not the primary source of comfort, discipline, or daily attention that we might now consider central to parenting. That role belonged to the nurse, and later, as the children grew, to a governess for the girls or a tutor for the boys, professionals hired specifically to provide the sustained daily presence the parents' own busy social calendar simply did not accommodate. And here is the genuinely poignant part of this particular arrangement. Children, being children, often formed their deepest early attachments not to their own parents but to the nurse who actually raised them, moment to moment, day to day, through every scraped knee and bedtime story and quiet 3 in the morning fever. There are accounts, plenty of them, of grown children of wealthy Gilded Age families writing, decades later, with more warmth and more specific, vivid memory about a beloved childhood nurse than about their own mother or father, a nurse who might have left the household's employ years earlier but who remained, in genuine emotional terms, one of the most significant figures of their entire childhood. Eventually, though, when that same nurse grew too old to continue the physically demanding work of caring for young children, or when the youngest child in her care finally outgrew the nursery, she was, in most households, simply moved on to another position if she was fortunate, to retirement on whatever modest savings she had managed if she was not, her employment ending in exactly the same formal transactional manner as any other servant's, regardless of how much genuine love had passed between her and the children she raised. The family's affection, real as it often was, did not translate into any lasting structural security for the person who had provided it, and I think that gap between genuine emotional bond and complete absence of practical obligation tells you something true and uncomfortable about how thoroughly this world had separated feeling from responsibility. Christmas, when it came, offered one of the year's rare moments where that separation softened, at least on the surface. Many households marked the holiday with small gifts for the staff, sometimes thoughtful and specific, sometimes a generic, slightly impersonal token distributed identically to everyone regardless of individual service or seniority. Some families hosted a modest servants' ball or a special Christmas dinner below stairs, occasionally even serving the staff a meal drawn closer to the family's own standard for one night of the year. A small, symbolic gesture that servants' own accounts describe with a mixture of genuine appreciation and clear-eyed awareness that a single generous evening did not undo 364 other days built on an entirely different, much harder standard. Let us slow all the way down now, because it is nearly 2 in the morning in the house we have been walking through all evening, and I want you to feel what this particular hour actually felt like down there, in the kitchen, in the servants' hall, in the long dim passage that ran the length of the basement. The range has been banked for the night, its fireboxes reduced to a low bed of orange embers that will need only a little coaxing come 4 in the morning to roar back to life. The kitchen itself, so frantic and loud just a few hours earlier, has gone almost entirely silent, the only sound the occasional settling tick of cooling metal and, somewhere farther off, the faint drip of the icebox's drain pan, a small, patient rhythm in the dark. The smell has changed too, softened from the sharp, layered chaos of active cooking into something quieter, the lingering ghost of roasted duck and browned butter and coal smoke, settled now into the walls themselves the way it settles, permanently into the walls of every working kitchen that has stood long enough. Somewhere above, the housekeeper is making her final rounds, a task that fell to her every single night regardless of how demanding the day had been, checking that doors were properly locked, that no candle had been left burning unattended, that the silver had been correctly returned to its locked cupboard. She carries a single lamp through darkened rooms that in daylight blaze with gaslight and the reflected shine of polished surfaces, and in this hour lit only by her small moving circle of light. The grand rooms upstairs take on an entirely different character, hushed, still, almost unfamiliar, furniture throwing long shadows across floors that will be swept clean again before anyone with a claim on noticing is awake to see it. Margaret, whom we met a little earlier tonight, is finally in her narrow bed beneath the sloped garret roof, and I think it is worth sitting with her for just a moment before we let her sleep, because this is the hour when a day like the one we have described finally actually ends, not with any ceremony, simply with a body too tired to stay upright any longer, sinking into a thin mattress under a single blanket, in a room cold enough that her breath is faintly visible in the dark. She does not think in this moment about vizies or wages or the precise geometry of the household's hierarchy. If she thinks anything coherent at all in these last conscious seconds about tomorrow, which will begin again in roughly 2 hours, and about whether her feet will have recovered enough by then to carry her through another 16 of them. And yet, and this deserves saying plainly, sleep in a house like this, however brief, however hard won, was genuinely restful in the way exhaustion sometimes produces, a deep, dreamless, total kind of sleep that people who have never worked this hard in a single day rarely experience. There is a particular mercy in that, small as it sounds. The body that has been pushed this far, this completely, does not lie awake worrying. It simply stops, all at once, like a machine losing its last remaining pressure, and does not stir again until it absolutely must. 2 hours later, the cycle begins again, and I want you to notice something about that fact before we move forward, because I think it is easy to let a detail like this pass by without really absorbing it. Margaret's entire rest, from the moment her head finally met the pillow to the moment someone knocked or called or the small clock on the garret wall reached its appointed hour, lasted perhaps 2 hours, on a night that had been, by the standards of this household, an unusually demanding one, though not by any means an unusual one in the sense of being rare. Dinner parties of this scale happened multiple times a week during the height of the season. This was not an exceptional night in Margaret's working life. It was closer to the ordinary shape of it, repeated, with small variations, for months at a stretch. The scullery maid wakes first, as she always does, and the whole vast machinery of the house begins, once again, its long climb back into motion, fire laid, water heated, grates cleaned, curtains drawn, all of it invisible, all of it necessary, all of it arriving, by the time the family stirs sometime after 9, as a household that simply, mysteriously already works. I want to step back now just for a moment and talk about something that has been sitting underneath this entire story, because I think it deserves to be said plainly rather than only implied. We know remarkably little, in comparison, about the individual lives of most of the people who worked in these houses. We know a great deal about the families who owned them, their names carved into stone, their portraits preserved in museums, their personal correspondence archived and studied and quoted in biography after biography. We know their weddings, their debts, their scandals, their triumphs, in extraordinary granular detail. The servants who made their entire way of life physically possible left, by comparison, almost nothing behind. a handful of memoirs written decades later by the rare few who had both the literacy and the inclination to record their experiences, and who often, understandably, softened or omitted the harder details out of a lingering, trained instinct toward discretion that never fully left them even in old age. A scattering of census records listing a name, an age, a place of birth, an occupation reduced to a single word: cook, housemaid, footman, with nothing beyond that bare fact to tell you who this person actually was, what she thought about while scrubbing a copper pot at midnight, what she dreamed of, who she loved, what became of her after the household that employed her eventually dissolved, as all of them eventually did, through death or changing fortune, or the simple passage of a century that had no further use for houses built to require 30 servants to run. This is, I think, the real and quiet injustice underneath everything else we have discussed tonight. Not simply that these people worked impossibly hard for very little, though that is true and worth remembering on its own. It is that history itself absorbed the same asymmetry the household was built on. The family's story got written down, preserved, told and retold. The story of the people who made that family's story physically possible mostly did not. And what we can offer them now, at this distance, is necessarily partial, reconstructed from fragments, filled in with reasonable historical inference rather than the specific, irreplaceable detail of an actual remembered life. I do not say this to make you sad exactly, though I would understand if it lands that way for a moment. I say it because I think the act of sitting here tonight, thinking carefully and specifically about a Margaret, about a Bridget, about a scullery maid whose name did not survive in any record at all, is itself a small, quiet correction to that asymmetry, however incomplete, not because attention now can undo neglect then, it cannot, but because remembering even imperfectly, even through composite and inference rather than exact fact, is still a form of honouring something that deserved and never received its own proper accounting. Let me tell you what tended to happen to these lives eventually, because service was rarely for most people a permanent condition, even though it often felt in the middle of it like it might never end. For many young women, domestic service functioned as a kind of bridge, a period of employment that lasted through the years between leaving her own family's household and starting one of her own. Marriage, when it came, usually meant leaving service entirely, because very few households permitted a live-in position to continue once a servant had a husband and soon enough children of her own to manage. The housemaid who married a tradesman, a policeman, a shopkeeper, stepped out of one demanding domestic world and directly into another, running her own household now instead of someone else's, though with the essential difference that whatever she built, however modest, however hard-won, finally belonged to her. Others stayed in service for decades, particularly those who reached the higher ranks: a cook, a butler, a housekeeper, positions that offered better wages, more authority, and in some cases genuine respect within the small, specific world of household service, even if that respect rarely extended beyond the green baize door into the wider society the family itself moved through. A butler who served one family faithfully for 30 years might retire with a modest pension arranged informally by a family grateful for his decades of discretion and competence, or he might, if fortunate and thrifty, have saved enough from a genuinely decent salary to purchase a small property of his own, a final quiet transformation from employee to something closer to independence. And some, inevitably, simply grew old within the system, moving from position to position as households dissolved or their own bodies grew less capable of the physical demands the work required, ending their working lives in reduced circumstances that the historical record focused as it remained on the families rather than the staff, rarely bothered to follow closely enough to tell us precisely how their stories concluded. I want to say something about the families too, before we close this evening, because I think it would be too simple and not entirely honest to leave you with the impression that every employer in this world was thoughtlessly cruel. Most were not cruel exactly. Most, I suspect, based on everything the historical record allows us to reasonably infer, simply did not think about it very much at all, and that in its own way is a different and in some ways more revealing kind of failure than active cruelty would have been. A system this thoroughly built for invisibility does not require malice to sustain itself. It only requires a kind of practiced, comfortable not noticing, an ability to walk past a housemaid in a hallway day after day, year after year, and genuinely not register her as a person with her own aching feet, her own private griefs, her own version of a life happening in parallel to your own, just 3 floors and 1 hidden staircase away. This not noticing was, I think, the water this entire world swam in, on both sides of the divide, upstairs and down, absorbed so completely into the ordinary texture of daily life that it rarely needed to be defended or even consciously acknowledged. It simply was how things were until, slowly, across the early decades of the 20th century, changing economics, changing labor expectations, 2 world wars that pulled an entire generation of potential domestic workers into factories and other better-paid employment, and a gradually shifting social consciousness about what work and dignity actually required of each other made this particular world, house by house, family by family, impossible to sustain in quite the same form. The great houses did not vanish overnight, but the 30-person staff, the hidden stairs built to make an entire working population disappear, the strict and absolute divide between what the family ate and what the kitchen ate, all of it thinned, gradually, generation by generation, until the world we walked through together tonight became something closer to memory than to lived reality. Let me take you to one more room before we start easing toward the close of this story, because there is a version of this world I have not yet shown you, and it belongs to a different kind of servant altogether. Picture the valet whose name, let us say, is Thomas, standing in his master's dressing room at close to midnight, well after the last guests have departed, laying out tomorrow's clothing with the same careful attention he brings to every task, though there is no one left awake to witness the care itself. A valet's relationship with his employer was, in its own way, even more intimate than a lady's maid's relationship with her mistress, because a gentleman of this era changed clothing multiple times throughout a single day: morning dress for breakfast, a different coat for calls or business, riding clothes if the afternoon called for it, and finally the formal black and white of evening dress. And every single change required Thomas's assistance, his knowledge of exactly how a particular coat should sit across the shoulders, exactly how a cravat should be tied that evening to suit the occasion, exactly which pair of gloves matched which walking stick for a call to a particular address. Thomas knew things about his employer that almost no one else in the world knew, not because his employer confided in him exactly, though a certain kind of easy, habitual conversation did sometimes develop between a gentleman and a valet who had served him for years, but because a body reveals itself completely to the person who dresses and undresses it every single day. Thomas knew about the old injury that still ached in cold weather, carefully concealed from public view by a particular cut of trouser. He knew about the private vanities, the specific way his employer liked his moustache trimmed, the cologne he wore only when a certain kind of evening was anticipated. He knew with a precision no biographer working from letters and diaries alone could ever fully reconstruct, the actual physical texture of another human being's daily existence. And in exchange for this intimate, total knowledge, Thomas received a modest salary, a small, plain room several floors removed from the man he dressed each morning, and an unspoken but absolute expectation that none of what he knew would ever travel beyond the walls of the dressing room itself. This was, in its way, one of the strangest bargains this entire world asked of the people living inside it. Complete intimacy, offered in one direction only, met with complete discretion required in return, and almost nothing resembling genuine reciprocal friendship expected or even particularly desired by the party who held all the power in the arrangement. Still, I keep returning to this because I think it is genuinely the truest thing this story has to offer. Something like real affection did sometimes grow inside even this profoundly unequal arrangement. There are accounts of valets who wept unashamedly at a long employer's funeral, having spent 30 years attending to a man's daily physical needs with a devotion that, whatever its origins in economic necessity, had become, somewhere along the way, something closer to genuine loyalty, even love. complicated and asymmetrical as it undeniably remained. I do not want you to fall asleep tonight thinking this world was only grinding and grim, because that would not be entirely true, and I think the people who actually lived it would want their story told with a little more texture than that. There were pleasures, small ones, carved carefully out of the narrow margins this life allowed. A half day off, however brief, however late it began, still meant a genuine outing, a walk in a nearby park, a visit to a sister or cousin working in service a few blocks away, the particular, simple luxury of choosing for a few hours exactly how to spend your own time, a freedom so rare in the ordinary week that servants' memoirs describe it with an intensity of appreciation that might surprise someone who has never had to earn their leisure quite this dearly. Music turned up too sometimes, in the servants' hall on a quiet evening. A footman with a passable singing voice, a housemaid who could pick out a tune on a battered old accordion someone had brought into service years earlier and left behind when she moved on. There was storytelling, ghost stories particularly, popular below stairs in houses old enough to have accumulated their own local legends, a suspiciously creaking stair, a cold spot in a particular hallway that more than one servant swore she had felt on a winter's night, tales told and retold with real relish during the rare stretches of downtime when the whole staff gathered in one room with nothing urgent demanding their attention. Humour lived there too, dry and specific, the kind that develops among people who share a very particular, very demanding set of daily circumstances. A private vocabulary sometimes formed within a household's staff, nicknames for difficult guests, shorthand references to particular mishaps that had become, over the retelling, genuinely funny stories rather than the small disasters they had been in the moment. I think about this a great deal, actually the way that hard shared experience so often becomes, eventually, a kind of currency for laughter. The same story that mortified someone in the moment becoming, a year later, the tale that made the whole servants' hall laugh until someone had to wipe their eyes, precisely because everyone at that table understood exactly how mortifying it had actually been. And there was pride, real and legitimate, in craft. A cook who had mastered a genuinely difficult French sauce took real satisfaction in executing it flawlessly, regardless of who received the credit for it upstairs. A lady's maid who could dress hair in the very latest Paris style, learned from careful study of imported fashion plates and painstaking practice, knew her own skill was considerable, whatever the household's formal hierarchy suggested about her relative worth. This pride belonged entirely to the people who earned it, untouchable by anyone upstairs. A private, sustaining satisfaction that no wage, however meagre, could fully account for or diminish. If you have ever visited one of these houses today, because some of them do still stand, preserved now as museums you can walk through for the price of a ticket, you may have noticed something particular about the experience. The grand rooms, the ballroom, the dining room, the library are lit and furnished and roped off for careful viewing, curated to tell the family's story in rich, considered detail. But if the museum has done its work thoughtfully somewhere in the tour, usually toward the end, almost as an afterthought in the building's own original architecture, you descend a narrow, unglamorous staircase into the basement, and you find the kitchen, still fitted in places with its original coal range, its copper pots, sometimes even its original bellboard still mounted on the wall, silent now, calling no one. I have stood in rooms like that myself more than once, and I will tell you honestly, there is something about standing in an original Gilded Age kitchen, touching the same worn edge of a stone sink that a scullery maid's raw, reddened hands touched 125 years ago, that affects me more than the grandest room upstairs ever has. The ballroom tells you what this family wanted the world to see. The kitchen tells you what actually happened here every single day for years to make that wanting possible. Let me show you one more kind of day, because the dinner party we walked through together was, in its way, the most dramatic version of this life, and I do not want you to think every day looked quite like that. Most days were quieter and in their own way just as revealing. An ordinary Tuesday, no guests expected, no particular event on the household's calendar, still began at the same 4 or 5 in the morning, still required the same fires laid, the same water carried, the same grates cleaned before the family woke. But the pace, once the morning's opening rituals were complete, settled into something closer to steady maintenance rather than frantic production. The cook might spend the morning on the household's actual daily marketing, either traveling herself to select provisions or reviewing what a trusted supplier had delivered, checking the quality of that morning's fish, examining a side of beef for the particular marbling that indicated good quality, negotiating in her own quiet, practiced way with tradesmen who had learnt over years exactly how exacting this particular cook's standards were, and adjusted their offerings accordingly. The housemaids moved through their weekly rotation of deeper cleaning tasks that a daily surface tidying did not cover, one day for the silver, another for the brass, another for turning and airing mattresses, another for the particular painstaking work of cleaning delicate items, porcelain, glass, the intricate carved woodwork that Gilded Age interiors favoured in such abundance, each surface requiring its own specific technique and its own specific cleaning solution, knowledge passed down maid to maid because no household manual could possibly anticipate every individual object a house of this scale actually contained. A lady's maid on a quiet day might spend hours on needlework, not for pleasure exactly, though there may have been some genuine satisfaction in the skill of it, but as ongoing necessary maintenance of an extensive wardrobe, a hem to be taken up, a small tear to be mended so invisibly that no observer would ever guess the garment had been damaged at all, trimming to be resewn after a change in fashion made last season's version suddenly subtly wrong. This was patient, exacting, close work, done by natural light near a window whenever possible to spare the eyes, hour after hour, day after day, an entirely separate skill from hairdressing or dressing a mistress, but every bit as essential to the role. And underneath all of it, on even the quietest day, ran the same undercurrent that defined every day in this house. The constant, low-grade awareness of being watched, or more precisely, of needing to behave at every moment as though you might be watched, even in rooms where no family member was actually present. A housemaid dusting an empty drawing room still moved with the same careful, contained economy of motion she would use if the mistress were standing in the doorway, because the habit of performed invisibility, practiced constantly enough, eventually stopped being a performance at all and became simply how a body moved through space, at work, and servants sometimes admitted later in life, even afterward, in retirement, in a home finally entirely their own, where old habits of quiet, careful, unobtrusive movement lingered decades after the actual need for them had ended. I think that detail, more than almost any other, tells you something about what a life like this actually cost a person, beneath the wages and the hours and the aching feet. It reshaped in some small but permanent way how a body existed in the world long after the specific house and the specific family that required it had become nothing more than a fading memory. Let me tell you a little more about the wine cellar, because it belonged almost exclusively to the butler's private domain, and it is one of the places in this house where a servant's genuine expertise mattered more than almost anywhere else. A well-stocked cellar in a house of this standing might hold several thousand bottles, champagne for celebratory occasions, claret and burgundy for dinner service, sherry and port for after-dinner conversation, along with rarer, more valuable vintages set aside for only the most significant occasions, a daughter's wedding, an anniversary the family considered worth genuine extravagance. The butler alone held the key to this room, and he alone determined, based on years of accumulated knowledge about temperature, aging, and the specific character of individual vintages, exactly which bottle should be brought up for exactly which course, exactly how far in advance a particular red needed to be opened to breathe properly, exactly at what angle and what speed an older, sediment-heavy bottle needed to be decanted to avoid disturbing its cloudy residue and ruining the clarity of what reached the glass. This was genuine expertise, built over decades, and a good butler took real professional pride in it, the same way the cook took pride in her sauces, or the lady's maid took pride in a perfectly executed chignon. He might have opinions, held privately but with real conviction, about which vintages the household was mismanaging by serving too young, which purchases the master had made on poor advice from a wine merchant more interested in his own commission than in genuine quality. None of this opinion, of course, was ever voiced upward. It simply lived in the butler's own private judgment, exercised quietly through his choices about which bottle to actually bring up on a given evening, a small invisible exercise of real taste and real authority inside a role that from upstairs looked like nothing more than simple service. I think there is something worth noticing in how much genuine skill this entire household economy actually required, distributed across dozens of people whose formal social status positioned them as essentially interchangeable labor, and yet whose actual daily work demanded years of specific, hard-won expertise that could not simply be replaced by hiring the next available applicant. The family upstairs benefited enormously from this expertise and in most cases understood almost nothing of its actual depth or difficulty. A perfectly decanted wine, a flawlessly executed sauce, a chignon that held all evening without a single pin working loose. These appeared, to the people enjoying them, as simply the ordinary expected baseline of a well-run household, rather than what they actually were, the visible tip of an enormous, invisible iceberg of accumulated skill. Let us return, before we close, to the paradox I mentioned right at the very beginning of tonight's story, because I think we are finally in a position to feel the full weight of it rather than simply hear it stated as a fact. The people who built the meal, hour by hour, ingredient by ingredient, technique refined over years of practice, never once sat down to eat it. Think about what that actually requires of a person, day after day, for a working life that might span decades. It requires holding two entirely separate relationships with the same object simultaneously, deep, expert, intimate familiarity with a dish's construction, and total permanent exclusion from its consumption. The cook could tell you by smell alone the precise moment a sauce had reduced to exactly the right consistency, could adjust a seasoning by a fraction of a pinch based on nothing more than years of accumulated instinct, and would never know in any direct sensory way what that final, perfected sauce actually tasted like on the tongue of the person eating it. I keep returning to this, turning it over, because I think it captures something essential about the entire system we have spent this evening exploring. It was not simply that servants worked hard or worked long hours or received low wages, though all of that is true and all of that matters. It was that the entire structure asked them to pour genuine skill, genuine care, sometimes something close to genuine artistry, into producing an experience they were, by the fixed and unquestioned logic of the household, permanently barred from having themselves. The gap between making and having, between the labor and its reward, was not incidental to this world. It was in a very real sense the world's entire organizing principle. And yet I do not think this means the labor itself was without meaning to the people who performed it. I have said this a few times tonight already in different forms, and I want to say it once more, plainly, before we let this story rest. There was real pride available in this work, real skill, real relationships, real moments of genuine warmth and even joy carved out of an arrangement that gave the people doing the work almost none of the credit and almost none of the material benefit. Human beings are, it turns out, remarkably capable of finding meaning inside even deeply unjust systems, not because the injustice does not matter, it plainly does, but because meaning-making is a fundamental human capacity that circumstance can constrain but rarely eliminates entirely. Margaret took genuine pride in a well-pressed uniform. The cook took genuine pride in a sauce she would never taste. Thomas took genuine, if complicated, satisfaction in dressing a man correctly for 30 years. None of that erases the unfairness of the underlying arrangement, but none of it was erased by that unfairness either. Both things again were simply true at once. Before we let the house go quiet for the night, I want to give you something like a roll call, imagined but grounded carefully in the real patterns of the census records and household accounts that survive from households very much like this one, because I think hearing the shape of these lives named, even in composite, even without the certainty of exact historical fact behind every single detail, matters more than skipping past it. A butler, 51 years old, English-born, in service since he was 14, in this particular household for the past 19 years, unmarried. His entire adult life folded into the rhythm of other people's dinners. A housekeeper, 44, widowed young, her husband lost to illness before they had been married 3 years, no children of her own. The household staff functioning in the quiet, unspoken way these things sometimes happen, as the closest thing to a family she has had since. A cook, 38, trained originally in a smaller household before working her way up through 2 more positions to reach a kitchen of this scale and reputation, sends a portion of her wages each month to a sister still living in the town she left 15 years ago, has not seen that sister in 11 of those years, writes to her faithfully anyway. A lady's maid, 26, quick with a needle, quicker with her memory for exactly how her mistress prefers each small daily ritual performed, privately saving toward a small dowry of her own, though she has told no one in the household this particular hope, because a lady's maid who reveals she is thinking of marriage risks being seen, unfairly but predictably, as a servant whose attention has already begun to wander elsewhere. 2 footmen, 23 and 25, hired in part for their matched height. Friends in the easy, uncomplicated way young men working the same demanding job often become friends, covering for each other's small lapses, sharing the particular exhausted humor of a job that requires you to stand still and composed for hours while your feet ache and your mind wanders somewhere else entirely. A kitchen maid, 19, still learning, still occasionally flinching at the cook's sharper corrections, though less than she did a year ago. Genuinely gifted with pastry in a way the cook has noticed and, in her own gruff manner, begun to cultivate. A scullery maid, 15, the youngest in the house, hands already showing the particular reddened roughness the work produces. Homesick in a way she has learnt to keep almost entirely private because there is no room in a 16-hour day for homesickness to be indulged, only endured. A hall boy, 12. Small for his age, carrying coal scuttles nearly as heavy as he is, sleeping in the smallest room in the entire house, dreaming, on the nights he has energy left to dream at all, of a life he cannot yet clearly picture but somehow, stubbornly, still believes is coming. I want to be honest that these are composites built from the genuine patterns the historical record preserves rather than from any single documented individual, and I think that honesty matters. But I also think there is real value in naming them anyway, in letting them stand, even briefly, as something more specific than the anonymous, collective phrase the household staff, which is how most surviving records from this period actually refer to them, when they bother to refer to them at all. There is something worth pausing on in the name itself, the Gilded Age. A phrase coined not by the wealthy families of the period celebrating their own era, but by a writer looking at it somewhat critically, borrowing the word gilded quite deliberately, because gilding, as any craftsman of the period would have told you, means a thin layer of gold applied over a base material that is not gold at all, brass or wood or plaster, made to gleam like something far more precious than it actually is underneath. I think that word choice was more perceptive than perhaps even its original author fully intended, because it describes with real precision exactly the architecture of the house we have spent this evening exploring together. The gleaming surface, the marble stairs, the French chef's terrapin soup, the ices moulded into swans, all of it genuinely dazzlingly beautiful in its way. And beneath that thin, brilliant surface, an entire structure of ordinary material, human beings, hundreds of thousands of them across the wealthy households of this era, working impossibly long hours for wages that left them little beyond survival, making the gleam possible through labour that the gleam itself was specifically designed to conceal. Gilding is not fraud exactly. The gold is real gold, however thin the layer. The dinner really was extraordinary, the silver really did shine, the evening really did dazzle every guest who attended it. But gilding, by its very nature, depends on something underneath agreeing to stay hidden, to provide structure and weight without ever being seen itself, and I think that is in the end the truest single image this whole story has to offer you. A house gleaming on Fifth Avenue, and beneath it, invisible, essential, entirely uncredited, the base material that made the gleam possible at all. Let me tell you what eventually happened to houses like this one, because I think the ending of the story matters too, and it happened more slowly and more quietly than you might expect. The peak of this particular way of living, houses staffed by 20 or 30 servants, dinners of 12 courses served to 30 guests on a regular basis, lasted in truth a relatively narrow window, roughly from the 1870s through the 1910s, a few decades of extraordinary concentrated wealth built on railroads, steel, oil, and finance, displayed through domestic architecture and domestic staffing on a scale that had genuinely never existed before in American history and has in quite the same form never fully existed again since. A world war changed things first, pulling young men who might otherwise have entered service into military service instead, and introducing, for the young women who might otherwise have become housemaids, new employment opportunities in factories and offices that paid better and demanded, whatever their own considerable difficulties, somewhat more reasonable hours and somewhat more personal autonomy than a live in domestic position ever had. Income tax, introduced in this period and gradually increasing across subsequent decades, began to erode the truly enormous, largely untaxed fortunes that had made a 30-person household staff financially unremarkable for the families who maintained one. And the broader cultural mood shifted too, gradually, unevenly, but unmistakably, away from the unapologetic, highly visible display of wealth that had characterized the Gilded Age at its height, towards something more restrained, at least in its outward presentation, even among families who retained enormous fortunes. By the 1920s and 30s, many of the grandest Fifth Avenue mansions had already been sold, demolished, or converted to other uses, their owning families finding the cost and complexity of maintaining a house built to require 30 servants simply impractical in a changed economic and cultural landscape. Some became museums, some became institutional buildings, schools, consulates, clubs. Many were simply torn down entirely, replaced by the apartment buildings and commercial structures that increasingly defined a stretch of avenue that had once been lined block after block with private mansions built to outdo the mansion next door. The servants who had staffed these houses scattered into whatever the changed economy of the 20th century offered them, some into other, smaller domestic positions that persisted in reduced form for decades longer, some into entirely different kinds of work, factory labor, retail, the expanding service economy of restaurants and hotels that offered in its own way a distant cousin of the skills they had spent years developing below stairs. A few, the ones who had entered service young enough and stayed long enough, lived to see the entire world that had shaped their working lives essentially disappear within a single lifetime, and some of them, in their final years, sat for the oral history interviews and wrote the late-in-life memoirs that give us most of what we actually know about this world from the inside, a small, precious, imperfect archive assembled just in time, before the last people who had actually lived it were gone, and the whole enormous, invisible machinery of the Gilded Age household passed entirely out of living memory and into the kind of history that has to be reconstructed carefully, respectfully, the way we have tried to do together tonight. Let me tell you about the rules governing exactly how a servant and a family member were permitted to interact, because the specificity of these unwritten codes tells you something important about how completely this world had been designed around managed distance. A servant, encountering a family member in a hallway or passage, was expected to efface herself as completely as the physical space allowed, stepping aside, turning her face slightly away, never initiating conversation, never offering an opinion unless directly and specifically asked for one. If addressed, a brief, respectful answer was correct. Anything more, any elaboration, any personal comment, any attempt to extend the interaction into something resembling an ordinary conversation between two people, risked being read as forward, presumptuous, a servant forgetting her place in a way that could genuinely damage her standing in the household. This rule applied with particular force to younger servants and somewhat less rigidly to senior staff. A butler or housekeeper of long standing sometimes permitted a slightly warmer, more familiar tone with a family they had served for decades, though even this familiarity operated within boundaries that both sides understood perfectly and neither ever tested too far. Eye contact followed its own specific etiquette. A servant was trained, almost from her first day in a new position, to keep her gaze lowered or directed at her task when a family member was present, meeting their eyes only briefly, if at all, when directly spoken to. This might sound like a small detail, but I think it is actually one of the more psychologically significant rules in this entire system, because sustained eye contact is one of the most basic ways human beings signal mutual recognition, two people acknowledging each other as simply people. Removing that recognition systematically day after day for years was a subtle but constant reinforcement of the household's core fiction, that servants existed to provide function rather than presence, service rather than relationship. And yet, precisely because these rules were so absolute in the household's public rooms, precisely because a servant's daytime self required this constant, careful management of gaze and posture and voice, the servants' hall at night, where none of it applied, must have felt like something close to relief every single evening, a kind of daily decompression that the family upstairs, who never had to perform this particular discipline themselves, could not have fully understood even if they had thought to wonder about it, which by most accounts they very rarely did. Morning calls deserve their own mention here too, because they represent one of the more elaborate social rituals of this world, and the household staff's role in managing them was considerable. Fashionable society in this period operated on an intricate system of visiting in which a lady would call at the homes of her social acquaintances during specific afternoon hours considered correct for such visits, leaving a calling card if the lady of the house was not receiving, or being admitted for a brief, carefully timed conversation if she was. The footman or parlour maid who answered the door on any given afternoon needed to know with real precision exactly who the mistress was currently receiving and who she was not, a determination that could carry real social consequences, since being turned away at the door, told the mistress was not at home when she was in fact very much at home, simply unwilling to receive this particular caller, was a coded social message that everyone involved understood perfectly, and it fell to the servant at the door to deliver that message with a straight face and an unreadable expression, regardless of how awkward the moment actually was. This required the household staff, and particularly whoever managed the front door, to hold in memory an entire constantly shifting social map, whose friendship with the family had recently cooled, which acquaintance had said something at a recent dinner that made her temporarily unwelcome, which calling card, once received, obligated the household to return the visit within a specific, socially correct window of time. A parlour maid who made an error here, admitting someone the mistress specifically did not wish to see, or turning away someone whose visit was in fact very much wanted, created a genuine social problem that the family would remember and that the maid would hear about, in whatever tone the housekeeper judged appropriate to the severity of the mistake. Mourning, when it came to a household of this kind, imposed its own elaborate set of rules, and the domestic staff bore a real portion of the labour required to observe it correctly. When a family member died, the entire household, family and staff alike, entered a formal period of mourning governed by extraordinarily specific conventions about clothing, correspondence and social withdrawal, conventions that had only grown more elaborate across the second half of the 19th century, in part following the very public, very extended mourning that a well-known European monarch had observed for her own husband decades earlier, a practice widely imitated among fashionable society on both sides of the Atlantic. For the staff, this meant an enormous, sudden shift in labour. Black-bordered stationery had to be sourced and used for all correspondence during the deepest period of mourning. Household mirrors were sometimes covered, Clocks stopped at the hour of death and left that way for a period, curtains drawn, a hush imposed on the entire house that servants were expected to maintain and in their own conduct visibly embody. The lady's maid faced the considerable task of assembling an entirely new mourning wardrobe for her mistress, black crepe and bombazine in the deepest first stage of mourning, gradually easing into greys and lavenders as the prescribed period progressed through its several formal stages, each with its own specific fabric and trim requirements that a lady's maid was expected to know precisely, because a mourning dress worn a stage too soon or a stage too late was the kind of small social error that observant acquaintances would notice and quietly judge. The household budget for mourning could be considerable, an entirely new wardrobe assembled on short notice, and the labour to produce or acquire it fell, as always, on people who themselves, if they lost a parent or a sibling back home, generally had no comparable resources or formal allowance made for their own grief. A servant who received word by letter that a mother or father had died back in Ireland or wherever her own family remained was rarely granted more than the briefest possible time away, if any at all, and was expected, whatever her private grief, to continue performing the household's own elaborate mourning rituals for a family member she may never even have met, with the same careful competence she brought to every other task. I find this particular asymmetry genuinely striking, actually. The way grief itself, universal as it is to every human life regardless of class, was accommodated so generously and so elaborately for the family, and so minimally, so nearly invisibly for the staff. It tells you something true about which lives in this world's own internal accounting were considered to carry weight worth pausing for, and which were expected to simply continue, however privately heavy the day had actually become. Let me tell you something a little more tender, though, because mourning was not only ritual and hierarchy. When a beloved member of the household staff died, and it did happen, illness and accident touched below stairs just as they touched every level of society in this period. The response from fellow servants was often genuinely moving. Whatever small resources the servants' hall could pool together for flowers, for a proper burial, for a modest contribution toward the funeral costs of a colleague who had perhaps no family nearby to shoulder that burden alone, were pooled without hesitation. A cook who had spent 15 years working beside a scullery maid who had over that time grown into a trusted kitchen maid herself felt that loss with a genuine, undiminished grief, whatever the formal hierarchy that had once separated their ranks, and the servants' hall, on the evening after such a loss, held a different, heavier quiet than its ordinary tiredness, one that the family upstairs, going about their evening entirely unaware, rarely had any occasion to notice at all. There is one more thing I want to tell you about, because it touches something more delicate, and I want to handle it with care. Households of this era occasionally faced situations involving a servant who became pregnant outside of marriage, and the household's response to this circumstance reveals, perhaps more clearly than almost anything else in this entire world, the real limits of the loyalty and protection servants extended to one another. In the harshest households, discovery of an unmarried pregnancy meant immediate dismissal, often without the character reference that would allow the servant to find another position, a consequence severe enough to represent in practical terms a genuine crisis for a young woman with few other resources. In gentler households, and these did exist, a sympathetic housekeeper might quietly help arrange for the servant to leave discreetly before her condition became obvious, preserving her reputation and, just as important, still providing a reference, sometimes vague, about the precise reason for her departure that allowed her some path forward. Fellow servants in these situations often closed ranks around their colleague with real, quiet solidarity, covering small physical changes for as long as possible, sharing what little money they could spare, offering the kind of practical, unglamorous kindness that never appears in any official household record, but that shaped, in very real and consequential ways, whether a young woman's life continued on some viable path or fell into the far harsher circumstances that awaited waited an unmarried mother with no family support and no reference in this period. I mention this not to dwell on hardship for its own sake, but because I think it belongs in any honest accounting of what loyalty below stairs actually looked like in practice. It was not simply covering for a broken vase or arranging a stolen hour for two people falling in love, though it was plainly that too. In its most serious form, it was servants extending each other real, meaningful protection against consequences that could otherwise permanently derail a life, offered not because any rule required it, but because the people extending it understood, better than anyone upstairs ever could, exactly how thin the margin for error in this world actually was, and how much a small act of solidarity quietly given could sometimes mean. Let me talk about money for a moment, in real terms, because I think numbers, handled carefully and translated into something tangible, can tell a story that description alone sometimes cannot. A butler in a grand New York household at the turn of the century might earn somewhere in the range of $40 to $60 a month, a genuinely substantial wage for the period, reflecting his position at the top of the service hierarchy and the real expertise and trust his role required. A cook of real skill might command a similar figure, particularly one trained in the French style that fashionable households specifically sought out and were willing to pay a premium to secure. These were, relatively speaking, good positions, offering not just wages but room and board included, which meant a servant in one of these senior roles could genuinely save a meaningful portion of what she earned. A path towards some modest independence that was simply not available to most working-class women of the period in other available occupations. Further down the hierarchy, the numbers shrank considerably. A housemaid might earn somewhere between $10 and $18 a month, depending on her experience and the specific household. A scullery maid at the very bottom might earn as little as $8 or $10 monthly, a wage that, even with room and board covered, left very little room for saving anything at all, particularly once a servant began sending a portion of her earnings home to family, as a great many immigrant servants did as a matter of course, understanding their wages, however modest by the standards of the household that employed them, as genuinely significant support for parents or siblings back in Ireland, in Germany, in the American South, wherever home had originally been. To put this in some kind of comparative perspective, the single dinner party we walked through together tonight, 30 guests, 12 courses, wine from a cellar stocked with vintages worth real fortunes, likely cost the household somewhere in the range of what an entire year's wages for several of its junior servants combined would amount to. I want to be careful here, because exact figures from this period are difficult to pin down with total precision, and I do not want to overstate a comparison in a way that claims more certainty than the historical record actually supports. But even accounting for that uncertainty, the general shape of the comparison holds, and it is a genuinely striking one. A single evening's entertainment, gone by midnight, largely forgotten by most of its guests within a matter of weeks beyond a pleasant general impression, represented, in wages, something close to what it took an entire junior servant a full year of 16-hour days to earn. I do not offer this comparison to make you angry exactly, though I would not blame you if it does a little. I offer it because I think precise, concrete numbers sometimes convey the actual shape of an unequal world more clearly than any amount of general description, and I think this particular comparison, the cost of one evening against the wages of 1 year, captures something true about the world we have spent this evening walking through that is worth sitting with directly rather than only feeling in the abstract. Let me tell you too about what a servant's rare free hours actually looked like when spent away from the household entirely, because I think it rounds out the picture in a way that pure description of labor alone cannot. On a half-day off, a young housemaid or footman in New York City at the turn of the century had, by the standards of their own working-class world, a genuinely appealing range of options, modest but real. A walk through a public park, Central Park chief among them, offered a version of green, open space that cost nothing and required no explanation to anyone, simply the pleasure of moving through a landscape you had not been required to clean or maintain for once. Sunday church attendance served a double function for many servants, genuine religious observance for those who held real faith, and equally genuine social opportunity, a chance to see friends from other households, to exchange news, to maintain the informal network of relationships across the city's domestic service community that helps servants learn of new positions, warn each other about particularly difficult households, and simply feel for an hour or two part of a community larger than the single household that otherwise consumed almost the entirety of their waking lives. For those with a little disposable income and an evening free, the era's popular entertainments, vaudeville theatres, dime museums, the occasional evening at a dance hall, offered a taste of the same delight and spectacle that in its grander, more expensive form, upstairs guests enjoyed every week at the opera or the theatre district's more fashionable houses. A servant's version of a night out was, necessarily, more modest, a cheaper seat, a shorter evening, a walk home afterward rather than a private carriage. But the pleasure taken in it, based on everything the servants' own later accounts describe, was every bit as real, perhaps sharpened, if anything, by how genuinely rare and hard-won these evenings actually were. Let me show you a different evening now, a smaller one, because I think it will round out your sense of this world in a way that the single grand dinner party we spent so much time on tonight cannot do entirely on its own. Picture a Tuesday evening, no guests at all, simply the family dining together, husband, wife, and perhaps an elder daughter recently allowed to join the adult table now that she has, in the language of the period, come out into society. This is a much smaller production than the 30-guest dinner we walked through earlier, 3 courses instead of 12, a single roast rather than the elaborate procession of soup and fish and game, and yet it is worth noticing that even this modest, private family meal still required a genuinely substantial amount of invisible labor to produce. The cook still rose before dawn, the kitchen maid still spent hours on preparation, even for a meal this comparatively simple, because a family that dined well every single night, whether guests were present or not, expected a consistently high standard regardless of the occasion's scale. The table was still laid with real care, the correct number of courses worth of silver set at each place, a small arrangement of flowers from the household's own greenhouse or a nearby florist placed at the table's center, because a family that had grown accustomed to a certain visual standard did not relax that standard simply because no outside eyes would witness it tonight. A footman still stood through the entire meal, present but unobtrusive, ready to refill a water glass or clear a plate at exactly the correct moment, his own evening stretching just as long as it would have on a night with 30 guests, even though the specific tasks required of him tonight were considerably lighter. This detail matters, I think, because it tells you something about how these households actually operated day to day, beneath the occasional spectacle of the grand dinner party. The infrastructure of formal service did not switch off simply because the audience for it had shrunk to 3 people who already lived in the house and saw each other, and the staff who served them every single day. There is something almost melancholy in this, if you sit with it for a moment. All that ceremony, all that careful silent choreography performed nightly for an audience of 3, none of whom most evenings likely paused to consciously register the considerable effort still quietly underwriting even their most ordinary Tuesday dinner. The performance of gracious, effortless living had, by this point, become so completely the household's default operating mode that it required no special occasion to activate. It simply was how the house functioned, every single night, whether anyone beyond the family itself would ever know or care. And yet for the staff, this quieter kind of evening carried its own particular relief, precisely because it was quieter. No 30 guests meant no frantic timing across 12 separate courses, no anxious calculation about seating precedence, no late-night cleanup stretching toward 1 or 2 in the morning. A Tuesday family dinner, however much labor it still required, generally allowed the staff to finish their evening duties by 10 or 10:30, a genuinely significant difference when measured against the 18 or 19-hour days that a grand dinner party demanded. Servants, across their memoirs, describe these quieter, ordinary evenings with something closer to gratitude than the grand occasions ever received, not because the work itself was dramatically lighter, but because the schedule, for once, left a little more room at the end of the day for something resembling actual rest. Let me tell you about the seasons themselves, because the physical experience of this labour changed considerably across the year, and I think it deserves its own attention. Summer in a New York mansion, before the family departed for Newport or wherever their own particular custom took them, brought its own specific misery to the below-stairs world. The kitchen, already the hottest room in the house by virtue of its enormous coal range, became in July and August genuinely brutal. Temperatures inside that range easily climbed past 100 degrees during active cooking, with no mechanical ventilation beyond whatever windows could be propped open and whatever breeze happened to find its way down into a basement kitchen that sat, by design, below street level. A cook and kitchen maid working a full dinner service in this heat did so drenched in sweat, their uniforms soaked through by the meal's end, in an era before any of the cooling technology we take entirely for granted now existed in any household form. The garret bedrooms fared no better once the sun had beaten down on the slate or shingle roof directly above them all day, retaining heat long into the night in a way that made genuine rest difficult even after an exhausting day's labour, servants sometimes resorting to sleeping with windows fully open regardless of noise or insects, or dragging a thin mattress onto the floor in hopes of finding air even marginally cooler than what pooled near the ceiling of these low-sloped rooms. Winter brought the opposite misery, and in some ways a more dangerous one. The kitchen itself stayed reasonably warm, thanks to the range's constant fire, but every other below-stairs room, the servants' hall, the pantry, the laundry room, and especially those same garret bedrooms, now suffered from the season's genuine cold, made worse because these rooms sat, as we discussed, at the farthest possible remove from any heated flue in the entire building. A scullery maid's chapped, cracked hands, already a hazard of her daily work in hot water and harsh soap, grew considerably worse in winter when the same hands moved constantly between scalding dishwater and a genuinely frigid scullery, a combination that servants' own accounts describe as producing a specific, persistent, aching pain that some who lived through it recalled clearly even 50 years later. Coal deliveries themselves became a significant winter task. Enormous quantities needed to keep the household's many fireplaces and the kitchen range running through the coldest months, hauled down into coal cellars and then, scuttle by scuttle, carried up to wherever they were needed throughout the day, a task that fell disproportionately on the household's youngest and most junior male servants, hall boys and junior footmen, whose backs and shoulders bore the accumulated physical cost of thousands of pounds of coal moved by hand across a single winter season. And I want to mention one more seasonal detail, because it captures something particular about the strange split awareness this world demanded. Even as the below-stairs world endured its own considerable winter hardship, the family upstairs experienced winter almost entirely as comfort, warm rooms, roaring fires lit and tended by hands that had themselves grown cold carrying the coal that fed those very flames, heavy furs and blankets that servants aired and brushed and stored through the warmer months specifically so they would be perfectly ready come the first genuine cold snap. Two entirely different winters unfolding simultaneously inside the exact same building, separated by nothing more than a few flights of stairs and an entire world of difference in whose comfort the household's resources were actually organized to protect. Let me tell you about one more kind of evening too, a difficult one, because I do not want you to think every dinner party unfolded as smoothly as the one we walked through together earlier tonight. Households of this kind occasionally hosted a guest whose behavior tested the staff's carefully maintained composure in ways that never appeared in any account of the evening published afterward. Picture a gentleman guest, perhaps overindulging in the evening's wine rather more than etiquette strictly allowed, growing louder, more demanding, snapping at a footman over some minor imagined delay in service, the kind of behavior that from a guest of sufficient social standing, the household simply had to absorb without visible reaction, however genuinely unpleasant it made the evening for the staff required to continue serving him graciously regardless. A footman on the receiving end of this kind of treatment had no real recourse in the moment beyond maintaining his composed, unreadable expression and continuing his duties exactly as though nothing unusual had occurred, a discipline that servants' own accounts describe as one of the genuinely hardest parts of the job. Not the physical labor itself, considerable as that was, but the sustained emotional restraint required to absorb real rudeness, sometimes real cruelty, from people whose social position made any visible response impossible without risking the servant's own livelihood. And here again the servants' hall afterward offered its particular relief, a space where that same footman could finally safely describe exactly what had happened, receive the sympathy and shared outrage of colleagues who understood precisely what that kind of evening cost, and perhaps, in the retelling, begin the slow process of transforming a genuinely difficult moment into the kind of story that, eventually, with enough distance and enough shared laughter at the guest's expense, might become almost funny in the particular hard-won way that only shared hardship survived together eventually can. I want to say one more thing about the hostesses themselves, the mistresses of these grand households, because I think it would be too simple to leave them entirely off stage as distant, unexamined figures of privilege, when the truth of their own position was in its own very different way, also more complicated than it might first appear. A society hostess of this era operated under her own considerable pressure, competing in ways that were never spoken of quite so bluntly but were perfectly understood by everyone involved, with the other great households of her social circle, each dinner party, each ball, each carefully curated guest list a small move in an ongoing, unending contest for social precedence that mattered enormously to families whose entire sense of standing rested on exactly this kind of continuous, visible demonstration of taste and resources. A hostess who served a dinner that guests found merely adequate rather than genuinely remarkable risked a subtle but real erosion of her household's standing, the kind of quiet social judgment that never appeared in any newspaper but circulated just as effectively through the same drawing-room conversations and private letters that built a reputation in the first place. This meant that the mistress of the house, whatever comfort and privilege she otherwise enjoyed, carried her own genuine anxiety about these evenings, a different register of stress than her staff's exhausted physical labor, but real nonetheless. The specific worry of a woman whose entire social identity depended on an evening's flawless execution, an execution she herself could not perform, only oversee, plan, and ultimately take either the credit or the blame for, depending on how smoothly her staff below stairs managed to make it look. I think there is something worth noticing in this too, a strange kind of shared investment, however unequal in its actual stakes, between mistress and staff on the night of a major dinner party. Both in their different ways needed the evening to succeed. The mistress needed it for her social standing, genuinely significant to her own sense of self and her family's place in a world she had likely spent her entire adult life carefully navigating. The staff needed it, more urgently, more materially, for their continued employment, their wages, their references, their entire economic survival. These were not equivalent stakes, not remotely, and I do not want to suggest they were, but on the specific night of the dinner itself, for the several hours the evening actually unfolded, mistress and staff were in a strange and rarely acknowledged way working toward exactly the same outcome, each dependent on the other's competence in ways that neither would likely have described using quite that word. This complicates just slightly the clean division we have drawn throughout this evening between upstairs and down, family and staff, without erasing the very real differences in power and reward that separated them. The house needed both halves of itself to function, the visible performance and the invisible labor that produced it, And on the particular specific night of a dinner like the one we walked through together, both halves, however unequally rewarded, however unevenly credited, were for those few essential hours genuinely and completely dependent on each other. Let me tell you about one more object before we move toward the close of this evening, because I think it deserves its place alongside the coal scuttles and copper pots and candle snuffers we discussed earlier. The household account book itself, kept faithfully by the housekeeper, page after page of careful, cramped handwriting recording every single expenditure the domestic side of the house required, from the largest order of wine for a major dinner party down to the smallest purchase of blacking for the boots. This book was, in its own way, one of the most honest documents this entire world produced, because unlike the society pages, unlike the guests' admiring letters describing an evening's splendor, the account book recorded the actual, unglamorous arithmetic underneath the gleaming surface. Here, in black ink, was the true cost of a single terrapin, the wages paid to each servant by name and position, the price of coal by the ton, the cost of replacing a housemaid's uniform when the old one finally wore through past mending. A housekeeper who kept this book with real care was in effect the household's most honest historian, though she likely never thought of her daily accounting in quite those terms, simply understanding it as one more essential task among the dozens that filled her own long working day. I think about these account books sometimes, the ones that survive in archives and historical societies now, available to researchers who want to understand, in genuine granular detail, exactly how a household like this one actually operated. And I think there is something quietly moving in imagining a housekeeper decades ago bent over this same book by lamplight after the rest of the house had gone to sleep, entering the day's final figures with the same careful, unhurried precision she brought to every other part of her considerable responsibility, never imagining that this particular ledger, more than almost anything else the household produced, would eventually become one of the few honest witnesses left to testify to exactly how her world, and the world of everyone who worked alongside her, had actually functioned. There is a particular entry type that appears again and again in these surviving books, and I want to mention it because it captures in the driest possible form the entire theme we have spent this whole evening exploring. Provisions for family table, a separate figure. Provisions for servants' hall, a consistently, sometimes dramatically smaller figure recorded on the very same page, in the very same careful hand, by a woman who managed both budgets daily and who understood better than almost anyone in the entire household exactly how wide that particular gap actually was, because she was the one who had to make both figures work every single week for every single person under that roof. One final piece of this world I want to leave you with before we return to the quiet house we began in, and it concerns the specific sound of the place, because I think sound, more than almost any other sense, carries memory in a way that is hard to fully explain and easy to fully recognize once you actually encounter it. A house like this one had its own particular soundscape, layered and constant, that anyone who lived or worked inside it for long enough would have absorbed so completely they likely stopped consciously hearing most of it at all. The low, steady roar of the coal range, never entirely silent during working hours, the specific metallic clink of silver against porcelain during a formal meal, a sound servants learned to produce with real precision, never a clatter, never a scrape, simply the soft, correct sound of good service happening exactly as it should. The whisper and rustle of skirts on stairs, upstairs the heavy silk of an evening gown, downstairs the plainer cotton of a housemaid's uniform, each recognizable to an experienced ear by its particular weight and texture even without looking up from whatever task currently occupied your hands. The bells, of course, that particular small mechanical ring that meant, instantly, unmistakably, that somewhere in the house someone required something, and required it now, a sound that servants across multiple decades of memoir writing describe as having embedded itself so deeply into their nervous systems that some of them, elderly now, writing these accounts many years after leaving service entirely, admit to still feeling a small, automatic jolt of alertness whenever a doorbell or telephone rings in their own home. A tiny, persistent echo of a working life that otherwise ended decades earlier. And underneath all of it, the quieter sounds, easy to miss unless you are listening for them specifically. The particular creak of the 13th stair on the service staircase, worn thin by thousands of footsteps over the years, that every servant in the house learned, eventually, to skip or step around lightly, especially late at night, when the last thing anyone wanted was to wake a light sleeping member of the family with an unexplained sound in the walls. The soft, steady drip of the icebox's drain pan, the particular hush of very early morning, before the range was lit, when the entire house held a kind of stillness that existed at no other hour of the day, brief, fragile, gone the moment the first fire was struck and the whole enormous, invisible machine of the household began once again its long climb into another day's motion. I think of everything we have discussed tonight, it might be this soundscape that would most immediately transport someone who actually lived through it, more than any single fact or figure, more even than the specific taste of a dish they never got to eat. Sound has a way of outlasting almost everything else in memory, quiet and persistent, waiting, sometimes for decades, for the right small trigger. A bell, a creaking stair, the particular clink of silver against china, to bring an entire vanished world rushing back, whole and complete, if only for a moment, before it recedes again into wherever memory keeps the things we cannot quite hold on to but never fully lose either. One more small thing before we let this rest. The bell board itself, that wooden panel of labelled bells I described near the very start of tonight's story, sometimes included one label that servants across several surviving accounts mention with a particular wry fondness. Front door, the bell that summoned whoever was nearest to answer whatever caller or delivery had arrived unannounced. It was in its own small way the one bell that connected the house's carefully sealed interior to the unpredictable ordinary world outside, and answering it, servants recalled, carried a small flicker of genuine curiosity each time, a brief unscripted moment in an otherwise thoroughly scripted day, never knowing, until the door actually opened, exactly what or who might be standing on the other side of it. I think in the end that is not such a bad note to close on, actually. A house built almost entirely around control, around knowing exactly who belonged where, exactly what could be seen and what had to stay hidden, exactly which door led where and which stair no guest would ever be permitted to notice, still contained within it this one small recurring moment of genuine unpredictability, a bell ringing, a door opening, the ordinary world briefly, unavoidably letting itself in. Perhaps that is true of every rigidly ordered system. In the end, however carefully designed, however completely it manages to separate and control almost everything within its reach, something always remains a little wild, a little uncertain, a little beyond the architect's original plan. A friendship that was never supposed to form across the rigid lines of rank, a romance that persisted despite every rule designed to prevent it, a small, unrecorded kindness, extended servant to servant, that no ledger anywhere ever thought to count. The house on Fifth Avenue was built to be perfectly ordered, perfectly separated, perfectly controlled, and it very nearly was, but not entirely, never quite entirely. And I think that small, stubborn human remainder, the part the architecture could never quite fully contain, is worth remembering tonight, more than any single fact about coal ranges or calling cards or 12-course dinners, because it is the part of this story that still, somehow, feels most alive. Let us go back one final time to the house we began with, because I think the right way to close a story like this is not with an argument or a conclusion, but with a return. The way you might walk back through a house you have just been given a tour of, room by room, letting each one settle a little more deeply into memory before you finally step outside. It is very late now, in the house on Fifth Avenue, later even than the 2 in the morning we sat with a little while ago. The last ember in the great coal range has finally gone fully dark, and the kitchen sits in a stillness so complete that if you stood in it right now, you would hear almost nothing at all, just the faint occasional settle of old wood somewhere in the building's frame. The kind of small sound old houses make at night that means nothing and everything depending on how you choose to listen to it. Upstairs, the family sleeps in rooms warmed by fires laid hours ago by hands that are, themselves, now finally still. The mistress sleeps in linens Bridget turned back for her. The master sleeps in a nightshirt Thomas laid out and will, in a few hours, exchange again for the first of tomorrow's several changes of clothing. The children sleep in the nursery, watched over even now by a nurse who dozes lightly in the next room, alert enough to wake at the smallest sound, a habit so deeply worn into her that it barely qualifies as vigilance anymore. It simply qualifies as how she sleeps. And below, in the garret rooms, tucked up under the sloped roofline, Margaret sleeps, and the 2 footmen sleep, and the cook sleeps in her slightly better room a floor below them, and the scullery maid sleeps, 15 years old, homesick in her dreams in a way she will not let herself be homesick in her waking hours, and the hall boy sleeps, curled small in the smallest bed in the entire building, 12 years old and already, in his own way, one of the people whose labour makes this whole vast, gleaming structure possible. I want you to picture the house now, the whole of it, all at once, the way an architect's drawing might show it in cross-section, every floor visible simultaneously, every room and every person in it laid open to view the way none of them ever actually were to each other while the house was awake. The ballroom, silent now, its chandeliers dark, its polished floor reflecting nothing but a little moonlight through tall windows. The dining room, cleared and reset, waiting for tomorrow's more ordinary meals. The kitchen, dark and cooling. The wine cellar, locked, its thousands of bottles resting exactly as the butler left them. The pantry, silver returned to its felt-lined drawers. The nursery, the garret rooms. Every single person in this building, upstairs and down, family and staff, finally, briefly, simply asleep, unranked, unwatched, unperformed, for these few private hours before the whole intricate machine begins turning again. This is the version of the house I wanted to leave you with tonight, not the gleaming one from the society pages, not even, entirely, the exhausted one we spent most of this evening walking through. This quiet one, this dark one, the one where for a few hours nobody in the entire building is required to be anything other than simply ordinarily human, tired, warm enough or not quite warm enough, dreaming or not dreaming, alive in the completely unremarkable way that every single person in every single room of that house, whatever their rank, whatever their wages, whatever the hidden architecture built to separate them, actually and fundamentally was. I think about Margaret sometimes, this composite Margaret we built together tonight out of 100 real fragments, and I find myself hoping, in the small, useless way you can hope for someone who exists only as a story, that her life turned out well after all this, that she married eventually someone kind, that her feet stopped aching eventually once the years of that particular labour were finally behind her, that somewhere in whatever came next for her she found a version of rest that was not simply exhaustion collapsing into sleep, but something gentler, something chosen, something entirely her own. That same hope goes out to you actually right now, wherever you are listening from tonight. I hope whatever your day required of you, whatever hidden labour you performed that nobody upstairs, so to speak, ever fully noticed or credited, is finally for these next few hours allowed to rest. You do not have to perform anything right now. You do not have to be useful or invisible or perfectly composed. You can simply lie there in the dark, in whatever room you have made your own, and let the last of today's weight settle out of your shoulders, out of your jaw, out of the small muscles behind your eyes that have been working all day without you ever quite noticing them. The house on Fifth Avenue is quiet now. The fires are banked, the bells are silent. Nobody is being summoned anywhere tonight. Let yourself be quiet too, somewhere above you, wherever you are. The same dark sky stretches over every version of this story, over the mansion and the garret both, over every gleaming surface and every hidden staircase, over every person who ever polished a piece of silver they would never be handed to use themselves, and over you too, right now, in your own particular version of rest, which is, whatever else may be true, entirely your own. Sleep well, friend. We have been somewhere real tonight, and somewhere quiet now, and that quiet is exactly where I want to leave you.